The silence comes first. Not the peaceful silence of sleep, but a heavy one, the kind that settles too quickly. In a dim Victorian nursery, gaslight trembling against patterned wallpaper, a baby's cries rise sharp and frantic, then stop. A spoon has been lifted, a few sweet-scented drops placed on a tiny tongue. Within moments, the child goes still, eyes fluttering, chest rising slow and shallow. The room exhales in relief. No one calls it danger, they call it care. If you're listening late tonight, take a moment to settle in with me. Lower the lights. And if these quiet histories draw you in, consider subscribing and staying. Tell me where you're listening from. What corner of the world is keeping you awake? There are many forgotten stories like this one, and they are best heard slowly. They called it poppy milk. It was sold openly in chemist shops, praised by doctors, and passed between mothers as a merciful solution to hunger, teething, restlessness, and exhaustion. A modern remedy for a modern age. What few admitted and fewer still understood was that this soothing liquid was steeped in opium, not a trace, not a whisper, but enough to still pain, dull hunger, and quiet infants for hours, sometimes forever. This is not a story of cruelty, but of trust placed in medicine, of desperation wrapped in etiquette and lace. A time when silence was mistaken for health, and a sleeping child was proof that everything was finally under control. Tonight, we step into that nursery and uncover the deadly truth behind poppy milk, the baby drug of the Victorian era. The silence comes first. It arrives not gently, but abruptly, like a door closing too fast in a narrow hallway. One moment, the room trembles with the thin, desperate cry of an infant. The next, it is gone. In its place hangs a stillness so complete it feels earned, almost virtuous. The gaslight flickers against floral wallpaper, casting shadows that sway like tired sentinels. Lace curtains soften the soot-stained window, filtering out the city's endless grind of wheels, hooves, and distant factory whistles. Inside this small, carefully ordered space, quiet is treated as proof that everything is finally as it should be. The crib sits near the hearth, carved wood polished smooth by generations of hands. Within it, a baby lies unnaturally calm, too calm. The chest rises, but slowly, shallowly, each breath a fragile negotiation with the air. Nearby, on a bedside table, rests a small glass bottle. Its label is neat, respectable, written in a confident hand. The liquid inside is pale, faintly cloudy, catching the light like watered-down milk. It smells sweet, floral even. Harmless, one might think. Comforting. Designed to soothe. This is not a scene of cruelty. That is what makes it so dangerous. Victorian nurseries were not places of indulgence. They were battlegrounds against hunger, illness, exhaustion, and noise. Infancy in the 19th century was a perilous state, marked by constant crying, frequent sickness, and an alarming proximity to death. Babies were born into homes thick with coal smoke, damp air, and bacteria no one yet understood. Milk spoiled quickly. Clean water was a luxury. Mothers were stretched thin by endless labor, grief, and expectation. To quiet a child was not simply to gain peace, it was to survive the night. In this world, silence became a moral achievement. A quiet baby was praised as good, well-raised, manageable. A crying one was a failure of discipline, feeding, or maternal competence. Manuals warned against spoiling infants with attention. Neighbors complained. Employers demanded productivity. Respectability required composure, even from the very young. And so, when something promised calm, deep, immediate, reliable calm, it was welcomed without suspicion. The spoon dips, a measured amount, though no one truly knows what measured means. There are no instructions worth trusting, No standards agreed upon. The drops touch the baby's lips. The effect is swift. Muscles slacken. The crying dissolves, not into sleep, but into submission. The child sinks inward, consciousness blurred, pain erased, hunger forgotten. To the watching adult, it looks like relief, like mercy, like success. This substance has a name that sounds almost gentle: poppy milk. It is spoken aloud without fear, passed between women in kitchens and nurseries, recommended by midwives and doctors alike. It is framed as natural, drawn from flowers, refined by modern knowledge. It is not called a drug. It is not treated as a risk. It is a solution, endorsed, normalized, invisible in its threat. What is rarely acknowledged is how often the silence lingers too long. Infant death in the Victorian era is everywhere and nowhere at once. It fills parish registers and burial grounds, yet rarely stirs outrage. Babies are said to have been weakly, delicate, never meant to thrive. Small coffins are common. Grief is expected, almost routine. In this landscape of loss, causes are seldom interrogated deeply. When a child does not wake, the silence is attributed to nature, not the bottle on the table, and so the nursery remains quiet. Outside, the city churns on, indifferent. Inside, the gaslight burns low, illuminating a scene that will repeat itself thousands of times across Britain. A drug sits where milk should be. Sleep masquerades as health. Stillness is mistaken for safety, and the silence so prized, so desperately sought, begins to claim its smallest victims, one quiet room at a time. The city is already awake when the nursery grows quiet. Long before dawn, London exhales smoke and steam, its lungs powered by coal and hunger. The streets thrum with movement even in darkness, boots on cobblestone, cartwheels grinding forward, factory bells calling bodies from shallow beds. There is no true night here, only dimmer hours when work pauses briefly before beginning again. Sleep, like silence, is rationed, earned, rare. For mothers, the city offers no mercy. Victorian London is a place of relentless demand. Women rise early to scrub floors, boil water, prepare meals that will barely stretch far enough. Some leave infants behind to work in factories, laundries, kitchens, and workshops. Others labor at home, sewing, washing, tending to lodgers. There is always something waiting, something undone. A crying baby is not just a source of concern, it is a threat. Noise invites judgment. Noise suggests failure. Noise risks employment, rent, survival. The walls are thin, respectability thinner. In overcrowded tenements, entire families occupy single rooms. Privacy is a luxury few can afford. Crying carries. It seeps through plaster and brick, through stairwells and shared courtyards. Neighbors complain. Landlords threaten eviction. Employers show little patience for exhaustion. A woman who cannot keep her child quiet is not seen as overwhelmed. She is seen as incapable. The city does not pause for infancy. Victorian babies are born into an environment actively hostile to life. Smoke hangs low in the air, coating lungs that have barely learned to breathe. Water is drawn from sources that carry invisible dangers. Milk spoils quickly, often diluted to make it last longer, robbing infants of nutrition even as it fills their stomachs. Illness moves freely: cholera, dysentery, measles, unseen but ever present. Survival itself feels provisional. Crying becomes constant. Hunger cries, pain cries, exhaustion cries. Babies cry because their bodies are overwhelmed by a world too harsh for their small systems. Teething brings fevers and convulsions. Colic twists bellies raw. There is no modern understanding of infant pain, no reliable relief. What there is instead is pressure. Pressure to cope, to endure, to maintain order in a life already stretched to breaking. In such a city, Quiet is not a luxury, it is a necessity. A calm baby means a mother can work. A silent nursery means a household can function. Rest is not indulgence, it is currency. And so any remedy that promises sleep is treated as a gift, not a gamble. The moral framework of the era reinforces this belief. Discipline is prized, self-control is virtuous. Emotional expression, especially excessive expression, is suspect. Even grief is expected to be contained. Children are not exempt from this worldview. Advice manuals warn against attending too quickly to a crying infant. Doing so, they argue, fosters weakness, dependency, moral softness. Better, they suggest, to teach restraint early. Better to cultivate quiet. In this context, sedation masquerades as education. A drug that stills the body is easily reframed as one that strengthens character. The city rewards such thinking. A baby who sleeps through the night is praised. A household undisturbed by cries is seen as well run. No one asks how the silence is achieved. The means matter less than the result. In a metropolis that measures worth by productivity and composure, the appearance of control becomes everything. And poppy milk fits seamlessly into this rhythm. It is easy to administer, quick to work, reliable in its effect. Unlike rocking or feeding, it does not demand time or energy. It does not require understanding. It delivers immediate results in a city that allows no patience for delay. In this way, the drug becomes an extension of industrial life itself, efficient, suppressive, indifferent to long-term consequence. The irony is cruel. London never truly sleeps, yet it teaches its smallest inhabitants to do exactly that. Not naturally, not safely, but chemically. While the city roars on outside, infants are pressed into artificial stillness, their cries absorbed by narcotics rather than answered by care. And in the ceaseless motion of Victorian life, where exhaustion is normalized and death is familiar, few stop to notice how often that stillness becomes permanent. The city keeps moving. The nursery stays quiet. And somewhere between the two, a generation of children is lost, not to malice, but to a world that valued silence above all else. A Victorian baby enters the world already under siege. From the first breath, the air is wrong. It carries coal dust, damp rot, the sharp tang of chemicals drifting from nearby workshops. Smoke presses low against the streets and creeps indoors through cracked windows and ill-fitting doors. Lungs meant for clean air struggle against particles they cannot expel. Coughing begins early. Wheezing follows. Survival is not assumed, it is negotiated, day by day. The body of an infant is fragile in ways Victorian society only dimly understands. Medicine has not yet mapped germs. Bacteria move unseen through water, milk, hands, and cloth. Feeding is an act riddled with risk. Breastfeeding, while idealized, is often interrupted by illness, malnutrition, or the simple necessity of work. Wet nurses are common but uneven in quality. Cow's milk is diluted, watered down to stretch limited supplies, stripped of nourishment in the process. It spoils quickly, even faster in summer heat. Infants drink what they are given, their stomachs ill-equipped to cope. Hunger becomes a constant companion. A crying baby is often not defiant or restless, but starving. Thin gruels and adulterated milk leave bellies full yet bodies weak. The child cries because something essential is missing: protein, fat, warmth, comfort. These cries are interpreted as fussiness, as temperament, as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a message to be understood. Pain is everywhere. Teething is feared not because it is uncomfortable, but because it is dangerous. Fevers spike, gums swell, convulsions are common. Infants scream until their voices rasp raw, bodies rigid with distress. Without modern analgesia, There are few tools to offer relief. The child suffers openly, visibly, relentlessly, and suffering, in Victorian moral logic, is often treated as something to be endured, not eliminated. Sleep becomes erratic, fractured, insufficient. Babies wake frequently, crying from discomfort they cannot articulate. Their caregivers, already exhausted, grow desperate for rest. Night after night, the same cycle repeats: crying, rocking, pacing, pleading. The body frays. Patience thins. In households where survival depends on early rising and long hours, broken sleep is not merely unpleasant, it is dangerous. The infant mortality rate looms like a shadow over every cradle. Death is common enough to feel ordinary, yet personal enough to haunt. 1 in 4 children will not live to see their 5th birthday. In poorer districts, the numbers climb higher. Small graves fill churchyards. Coffins for infants are sold cheaply, stocked in advance. Loss is expected, folded quietly into daily life. Grief exists, but it is contained, muted, disciplined. This normalization of death reshapes perception. When a baby grows ill, it is not always seen as a crisis. Sometimes it is seen as fate. Weak constitutions are blamed. Mothers are told their children were never strong enough. Explanations rarely go further. Few ask whether the environment itself is complicit. Fewer still consider that the remedies meant to help might be hastening the end. Against this backdrop, cries become intolerable. They are reminders of fragility, of danger, of the thin line between life and death. Silencing them offers emotional relief as much as physical quiet. A calm baby feels like a victory against the chaos pressing in from every side. It reassures caregivers that they are doing something right in a world that offers little reassurance at all. This is where poppy milk finds its foothold, not as a luxury, not as a vice, but as a solution to a problem that feels overwhelming and unending. When an infant finally sleeps deeply, heavily, unnaturally, it appears as though the struggle has eased. Pain seems gone, hunger seems forgotten. The house rests, the mother rests, the city, for a moment, recedes. No one sees the cost immediately. The slowed breathing, the dulled reflexes, the body pushed beyond what it can safely endure. In an age already accustomed to losing children, the difference between illness and overdose is blurred beyond recognition. When a baby does not wake, the explanation arrives easily: another fragile life, another inevitability. And so, in the age of soot and smoke, where survival itself feels provisional, a drug that quiets infants slips seamlessly into daily care. It does not announce itself as dangerous. It presents as mercy in a world that has little to spare. The cries fade, the nursery grows still, and the true nature of that stillness remains unseen, hidden beneath lace, etiquette, and a city that never stops to ask why so many of its youngest fall silent. Quiet, in the Victorian mind, is not neutral, it is virtuous. A silent room suggests order. A hushed child implies discipline. Calm is treated not merely as a state of being, but as evidence of moral fiber, of proper upbringing, of a household functioning as it should. Noise, by contrast, carries suspicion. Crying signals disorder. It hints at indulgence, incompetence, or failure to instill restraint. In a society obsessed with appearances, sound becomes a measure of worth. This belief settles early and deeply. From advice manuals to sermons, the message repeats itself with unwavering confidence. Children must learn self-control from the very beginning. Excessive attention is said to weaken character. Immediate comfort is framed as indulgence. A baby who cries too much is not always seen as suffering, but as being trained, either correctly or poorly. Mothers are warned not to rush too quickly to the cradle, not to encourage dependency, not to allow emotion to rule the household. The nursery becomes a proving ground. Victorian parenting literature treats infancy not as a vulnerable stage requiring constant reassurance, but as the first battleground in a lifelong struggle between discipline and weakness. The child must learn, even before memory forms, that the world will not bend to discomfort. Silence is framed as strength, stillness as obedience. A baby who sleeps soundly, cries little, and disrupts nothing is praised as exemplary. Calm, therefore, becomes performative. A quiet child reflects well on the mother. It signals respectability to neighbors, competence to employers, and virtue to family elders. In a rigid social hierarchy, such signals matter. Women, already under scrutiny, are judged relentlessly by the behavior of their children. A crying infant is not merely loud, it is a public statement of maternal failure. This pressure intensifies in shared spaces. In boarding houses, slums, and crowded terraces, one child's cries disturb dozens. Complaints follow swiftly. Accusations are whispered. Mothers are advised, sometimes harshly, to do something about it. The expectation is clear. Noise must be controlled, whatever the means. Sympathy is limited. Patience, thinner still. And so calm becomes a goal at any cost. The concept of comfort shifts subtly but dangerously. Rather than alleviating the cause of distress, hunger, pain, fear, the focus turns to suppressing its expression. The cry itself becomes the problem, not what produces it. In this logic, a remedy that stops noise is automatically considered successful, regardless of what it does to the body. Poppy milk thrives in this space. It does not promise health in any measurable sense. It promises quiet, and quiet, within the Victorian moral framework, is indistinguishable from improvement. When a baby stops crying after being dosed, the conclusion feels obvious. The remedy works, the child is calm, order is restored, the household breathes easier. Few pause to question the nature of that calm. The child's limp limbs, glazed eyes, and unnaturally heavy sleep are interpreted as relief rather than alarm. Pain is assumed to have subsided, hunger forgotten, exhaustion resolved. The visible struggle has ended, and that is what matters. In a culture trained to value restraint over expression, the absence of distress is taken as proof of well-being. There is also an emotional incentive at play. Crying is distressing to hear. It unsettles the nerves, sharpens guilt, and magnifies exhaustion. Silence offers psychological relief to caregivers already stretched beyond capacity. When poppy milk delivers that relief swiftly and reliably, it feels like salvation rather than risk. The temptation to repeat the dose grows quietly, naturally, without malice. Doctors reinforce this belief. Medical authority in the Victorian era often aligns with social expectations rather than challenging them. A quiet infant is easier to manage, easier to examine, easier to dismiss as healthy. Physicians speak approvingly of calm dispositions. Sedation, when it produces order, is rarely interrogated deeply. The goal of treatment is not always to restore vitality, but to reduce disruption. Thus, the cult of calm entrenches itself. Silence is praised, stillness is rewarded. Babies are shaped, chemically and culturally, to fit an adult ideal of composure. Their bodies, still forming, are pressed into unnatural quiet to satisfy a society that cannot tolerate visible distress. And when that silence deepens beyond sleep, when it becomes final, it is absorbed seamlessly into a worldview already accustomed to loss. Another weak child, another fragile life, another quiet room. The cult of calm does not see itself as cruel. It sees itself as civilized. And in that belief, countless infants are lulled not into rest, but into a silence from which they will never wake. Before poppy milk ever reached the cradle, the Victorian nursery was already crowded with cures. Shelves held powders, syrups, tinctures, and teas, each promising relief from crying, convulsions, fever, or sleeplessness. Remedies were passed hand to hand, generation to generation, their origins half forgotten but their authority unquestioned. In a world where medical certainty was rare, tradition filled the gaps. What had been used before would be used again. Many of these treatments were gentle in intention, if not always in effect. Warm baths were drawn to calm, restless bodies. Gums were rubbed with honey or spirits to ease teething pain. Infants were swaddled tightly, bound into stillness in the belief that motion itself invited distress. Some mothers carried their children for hours, pacing narrow rooms until their legs trembled with fatigue. Others relied on prayer, murmured softly through exhaustion, asking for strength more than answers. But desperation crept in quickly. When gentler methods failed, stronger ones followed. Alcohol made frequent appearances, brandy diluted with water, wine mixed into milk, drops of gin rubbed onto aching gums. Spirits were not seen as dangerous. They were seen as warming, fortifying, soothing. A baby rendered drowsy by alcohol was assumed to be comforted, not impaired. The boundary between nourishment and intoxication blurred easily. Soothing syrups became especially popular. Sold under names that suggested innocence and care, they promised to settle the stomach and calm the nerves. Their ingredients were rarely disclosed in full. Laudanum, paregoric, and other opiate-based mixtures slipped quietly into domestic medicine cabinets. Mothers did not think of them as narcotics. They thought of them as modern improvements on folk wisdom, scientific, measured, respectable. Advice manuals reinforced this confidence. Victorian childcare guides often included recipes for home remedies that would horrify later generations. Opium-infused mixtures were described as useful, even prudent, when administered carefully. Careful, however, was a vague concept. Dosages varied wildly. A few drops for one child became a spoonful for another. Strength differed from batch to batch. Bodies responded unpredictably. Yet the language of authority cloaked these substances in reassurance. Midwives played a crucial role. Often trusted more than physicians, they were present in the most vulnerable moments: birth, illness, exhaustion. Their recommendations carried weight. When a midwife suggested a calming mixture, it was rarely questioned. She had seen children survive. She had seen others fade. The difference between the two was seldom attributed to the remedy itself. Folk belief intertwined seamlessly with emerging medicine. Opium had long been associated with sleep and relief. Poppies symbolized rest, peace, forgetting. The leap from adult use to infant use did not feel radical. If something could quiet an adult's pain, why would it not soothe a child's? The logic seemed sound, especially in a society that viewed children as small, incomplete versions of adults rather than beings with distinct physiological needs. Crying, meanwhile, continued, unabated. Night after night, the same patterns repeated. A baby screamed in pain or hunger. A caregiver tried rocking, feeding, singing. Hours passed. Exhaustion set in. When a remedy finally produced silence, it felt miraculous. The cause of that silence mattered less than its arrival. Gradually, a hierarchy of remedies emerged. Those that worked slowly fell out of favor. Those that worked immediately, those that guaranteed quiet, rose quickly to the top. The more reliably a substance silenced distress, the more valuable it became. In this calculus, safety was secondary to effectiveness. Long-term consequences were invisible. Short-term relief was everything. This is the soil in which poppy milk would flourish. It did not appear as a shocking innovation, but as the logical next step in a long tradition of sedation disguised as care. It promised what parents and caregivers wanted most: a quiet child, a peaceful night, a moment of control in a world that offered very little. By the time poppy milk entered common use, the idea that an infant might need chemical assistance to sleep had already been normalized. The nursery had become a place where calm was manufactured rather than nurtured. And so, when the poppy arrived, steeped, sweetened, and potent, it did not feel like a risk. It felt like relief, a remedy for the restless child, a solution that asked no questions, and one whose consequences would not be fully understood until far too many cradles had fallen silent. The poppy had long been part of the adult world before it ever touched a child. For centuries, opium moved quietly through medicine and ritual, praised for its ability to dull pain, invite sleep, and soften the edges of consciousness. Physicians relied on it. Apothecaries stocked it. Writers romanticized it. In measured doses, it was considered a gift dangerous only in excess, and excess, it was assumed, could always be avoided with care. That assumption followed the poppy into the nursery. At first, its presence there was subtle. A few drops added to an already familiar syrup. A tincture diluted heavily, offered only at night. A whispered recommendation between women who had reached the limits of endurance. No announcement was made. No line was crossed in the public imagination. It felt like an extension of existing practice, not a departure from it. The poppy did not arrive as a villain. It arrived as a helper. Its transformation into poppy milk softened its image further. Milk suggested nourishment, gentleness, motherhood itself. The name wrapped the drug in domestic familiarity, disguising its potency beneath something intimate and comforting. Few stopped to consider that this milk bore no nutritional value, no sustaining properties, only sedation. Preparation varied from home to home. Some steeped poppy heads in warm water, creating a cloudy infusion whose strength depended entirely on guesswork. Others purchased ready-made mixtures from chemists, trusting that professional hands had ensured safety. The liquid was often sweetened, sometimes thickened, its bitterness masked so infants would swallow without resistance. What emerged was a substance deceptively mild in appearance and devastatingly powerful in effect. The first dose often felt like a revelation. A baby who had screamed for hours grew still within minutes. Limbs relaxed, eyes closed, breathing slowed. The transformation was so dramatic, it inspired awe. Here was something that worked when nothing else had. Here was proof that the struggle could be ended swiftly, decisively. To exhausted caregivers, it felt less like drugging and more like rescue. Fear had no place in that moment. Any lingering unease was drowned out by relief. The house fell quiet. Neighbors stopped complaining. Mothers could sit, breathe, think. In a society that offered little support and endless judgment, poppy milk seemed to provide exactly what was needed. Its success was immediate and visible. Its dangers were silent and delayed. Medical endorsement soon followed domestic practice. Doctors, themselves accustomed to prescribing opium freely, saw little reason to object. Infants, they believed, suffered from excessive sensitivity, overactive nerves, uncontrolled reflexes. Sedation was framed as a way to restore balance, calm the system, prevent exhaustion, allow the body to heal. Few questioned whether an infant's system should ever be calmed so deeply. Dosage remained an abstraction. There were no standardized measurements, no understanding of infant metabolism, no appreciation for how quickly a small body could be overwhelmed. A spoonful that quieted one child might suffocate another. Variability was dismissed as individual weakness rather than evidence of danger. When tragedy struck, it was blamed on frailty, not the substance itself. Cultural trust did the rest. Victorian society placed enormous faith in progress, science, and refinement. The idea that a commonly used remedy endorsed by professionals and embraced by families could be inherently dangerous felt incompatible with this worldview. To question poppy milk would be to question authority, tradition, and the promise of modernity itself. And so the poppy settled into the cradle. It became part of nightly routines, administered with the same casual confidence as feeding or swaddling. Its use spread across class lines, from slum tenements to respectable middle-class homes. In wealthier households, it was measured and discreet. In poorer ones, it was sometimes stronger, more frequent, driven by greater need and fewer alternatives. Each dose deepened the illusion. The child slept, the house stayed quiet. Life continued, no alarms rang, no warnings were printed. The poppy did exactly what it promised, and that promise was enough. What went unseen was the slow accumulation of harm, the bodies pushed beyond safe stillness, the breathing dulled too far, the line between sleep and death crossed without ceremony. By the time doubts began to surface, poppy milk was no longer a novelty. It was a habit, a trusted presence, and one that would leave behind a legacy of silence far heavier than anyone had intended. Behind the gentle name, there was nothing gentle at all. Poppy milk was not milk in any meaningful sense. It offered no nourishment, no strength, no sustenance for a growing body. It was a suspension of sleep, a chemical quieting disguised as care. Its whiteness, its sweetness, its domestic familiarity were illusions, layers of comfort laid carefully over a substance that acted directly on the most fragile systems of the infant body. At its core, poppy milk was opium. Derived from the dried seed heads of the poppy plant, opium contained powerful alkaloids, morphine foremost, among them capable of suppressing pain, slowing respiration, and dulling consciousness. In adults, these effects were understood in broad terms. In infants, they were barely considered at all. The difference in scale between an adult body and a newborn's was acknowledged, but not truly comprehended. The assumption persisted that smaller bodies merely required smaller doses. This assumption was disastrously wrong. An infant's liver could not process opiates efficiently. Their nervous system, still forming, responded with exaggerated sensitivity. What seemed like a mild sedative to an adult could overwhelm a child's breathing reflex within minutes. The margin between calm and collapse was impossibly thin. Yet poppy milk was administered casually, often repeatedly, without any understanding of how quickly danger accumulated. The preparation itself invited catastrophe. Homemade poppy milk varied wildly in strength. One batch might be weak, another lethally concentrated, depending on the number of poppy heads used, their maturity, and how long they were steeped. There were no instructions that could ensure consistency. Chemist-made versions were scarcely better. Patent mixtures often concealed their true potency behind proprietary secrecy. Labels emphasized soothing qualities, not ingredients. Parents were left guessing, trusting, hoping. Sweeteners compounded the risk. Sugar, honey, and syrups were added to mask bitterness and encourage swallowing. These additions made poppy milk easier to administer and easier to over-administer. A baby who accepted the spoon without protest invited another dose, and another. Each one slowed breathing further, pressed consciousness deeper into darkness. The effect was often misread as success. A baby under the influence of opium does not sleep naturally. The body enters a state of suppression, muscles slack, reflexes dulled. Breathing becomes shallow and irregular. The child does not stir when uncomfortable, does not wake when hungry, does not cry when distressed. To an exhausted caregiver, this looks like peace. To a trained observer, if such an observer had existed, it would have looked like warning. But there were no trained observers in the nursery. Medical texts of the era spoke vaguely of calming the nerves and settling the system. They lacked the language to describe respiratory depression or central nervous system suppression. Without that language, danger remained invisible. What could not be named could not be feared. Poppy milk also blurred into other opiate preparations. Laudanum, paregoric, Godfrey's cordial all circulated freely, sometimes substituted for one another, sometimes combined unknowingly. Mothers might switch remedies when one seemed less effective. unaware that they were stacking doses of the same drug under different names. Each product promised relief. None warned of cumulative effect. Tolerance began to develop. Infants who survived repeated dosing often required more to achieve the same silence. This was not recognized as dependency. It was seen as stubbornness, increased sensitivity, worsening temperament. The solution was always the same: a stronger dose. The cycle tightened quietly, without drama, without acknowledgement. When death occurred, it left few obvious marks. There were no violent convulsions in every case, no sudden collapse. Often, the child simply did not wake. The body cooled, the stillness deepened. To families already familiar with infant loss, this did not appear extraordinary. Another delicate constitution. Another tragedy without a culprit. Poppy milk, then, was not an accident of ignorance alone. It was the convergence of chemistry, culture, exhaustion, and belief. A drug powerful enough to silence pain, placed into a society desperate for quiet, and wrapped in language that erased its danger. It was not administered with cruelty, but with trust, not given in malice, but in hope. And that hope, misplaced, unexamined, and reinforced by authority, would cost more lives than anyone was prepared to count. The bottle on the bedside table looked harmless. The truth inside it was anything but. The danger of poppy milk was not only in what it contained, but in how carefully that truth was hidden. Opium, in its raw form, is bitter, sharp, unmistakable. Left undiluted, it would have provoked resistance even from the smallest mouth. An infant might have spat it out, gagged, cried harder than before. That bitterness, had it remained, might have served as a warning. Instead, it was erased. Sugar did the work. Victorian remedies leaned heavily on sweetness, not merely to improve taste, but to communicate intent. Sweetness signaled gentleness, care, safety. What tasted pleasant could not, in the popular imagination, be harmful. Honey, treacle, syrup, and sugar water were folded into poppy preparations until the drug's harshness disappeared entirely. What remained was something deceptively mild, almost comforting, an aroma faintly floral, a flavor that lingered softly on the tongue. The poppy itself aided the illusion. Its scent was not chemical or acrid, but earthy, botanical, natural. Flowers carried symbolic weight in Victorian culture. They spoke of innocence, rest, and beauty. The poppy, in particular, had long been associated with sleep and peace. Art and poetry reinforced this imagery, depicting poppies as benign agents of forgetfulness rather than instruments of suppression. When steeped into milk-like infusions, the association felt almost poetic. No one imagined poison in a flower. This sensory disguise mattered deeply in the nursery. A remedy that smelled harsh or tasted medicinal invited doubt. One that smelled sweet and went down easily inspired confidence. Infants swallowed without protest. Caregivers relaxed. The act of dosing became routine, unremarkable, stripped of tension. A spoon offered gently, a mouth opened reflexively. Silence followed. The transformation felt too clean to question. Within minutes, crying softened, then stopped altogether. The child's face slackened into something resembling peace. Eyes fluttered, then closed. Breathing slowed. The nursery fell still, not with the uneasy quiet of sickness, but with a calm that felt earned. In that moment, the sweet scent in the air seemed to confirm success. The remedy had worked. But sweetness masks more than bitterness. It masks urgency. It blunts instinct. A caregiver might hesitate if a substance appeared harsh or dangerous. When it feels benign, hesitation dissolves. The line between medicine and food blurs. Poppy milk, sweetened and pale, took on the visual language of nourishment. It sat beside actual milk. It replaced feeding. It was sometimes given instead of food, quieting hunger by suppressing it rather than satisfying it. This substitution carried its own risks. Infants already undernourished were further deprived. Their bodies weakened quietly while their cries were chemically erased. Weight loss went unnoticed beneath blankets. Lethargy was mistaken for contentment. The sweet solution kept the baby silent long enough for caregivers to believe the problem had passed. Repeated dosing deepened the deception. The first time might inspire caution, the second, relief. By the third, confidence. Each successful silencing reinforced the belief that the remedy was safe. Any lingering doubt was dulled by exhaustion and reinforced by social approval. Other mothers used it. Midwives recommended it. Chemists sold it without hesitation. There was no visible reason to stop. The sensory experience did the rest. The floral note lingered in the room, soft and pleasant, mingling with soap and clean linen. It did not smell like danger. It did not announce itself as a narcotic. It blended seamlessly into domestic life. This quiet familiarity made the drug invisible, even as it worked directly against the infant's most basic survival reflexes. Respiration slowed further with each dose. The body's instinct to wake, to cry, to demand air was gently muted. The same sweetness that made the medicine easy to swallow made it easy to give too much. A little more to keep the baby asleep. A little more to prevent the crying from returning. Each addition felt minor. The cumulative effect was anything but. When death came, it rarely came loudly. There were no alarms, no violent reactions. The child simply failed to wake. The sweetness that had eased the medicine into the body left no trace of its passage, no bitterness on the lips, no sign of struggle, just stillness. A deeper, final silence that blended too easily into a world already accustomed to infant loss. The sweetness remained blameless. Parents did not look at the bottle and see danger. They saw relief. They smelled flowers, not chemicals. They tasted sugar, not opium. The sensory deception was complete, and in that deception lay the drug's deadliest power. Poppy milk did not force itself into the nursery. It slipped in gently sweet, floral, and lethal, carried on a spoon that looked like care itself. There was nothing on the bottle to suggest fear. No skull, no cautionary script, no measured instructions that carried the weight of consequence. Poppy milk entered the Victorian nursery, unannounced by danger, wrapped instead in confidence. Its containers bore neat handwriting, reassuring names, and promises of calm. If warnings existed at all, they were vague phrases like "use sparingly" or "administer with care," words so soft they dissolved on contact with exhaustion. In an era before regulation, labels were acts of persuasion rather than protection. Chemists were not required to list ingredients in full. Patent medicines thrived on secrecy, their formulas guarded as intellectual property. The less a parent knew, the more they trusted the authority behind the bottle. Opium could hide behind euphemism, buried beneath terms like soothing, cordial, restorative. What was not named could not be feared. Dosage, when mentioned, was a suggestion at best. A few drops, a small spoon, as needed. These instructions assumed a shared understanding that did not exist. What was small to one caregiver was ineffective to another. One child's tolerance became another's fatal threshold. There were no scales in the nursery, no charts accounting for age, weight, or health. Judgment filled the gap where science should have stood. That judgment was shaped by desperation. A baby who continued to cry after a recommended dose was not seen as reacting safely, it was seen as resistant. The remedy was assumed to be insufficient, not dangerous. The logical response was to increase the amount. Silence was the metric of success. Anything less felt like failure. Medical authority did little to interrupt this pattern. Physicians themselves relied heavily on opiates. They prescribed them for coughs, pain, anxiety, insomnia. Their own familiarity bred complacency. If adults tolerated these substances well, why should infants not do the same in smaller quantities? The unique vulnerability of the infant body was poorly understood and rarely emphasized. When tragedies occurred, they left little evidence. An infant who died quietly after being dosed did not present dramatic symptoms. There were no violent convulsions in every case, no unmistakable signs of poisoning. The body simply slowed, then stopped. To a physician called afterward, the death appeared consistent with countless others attributed to weakness, fever, or failure to thrive. Without visible markers, the remedy escaped suspicion. Coroners faced the same limitations. Post-mortem examinations of infants were rare and rudimentary. Toxicology as a science did not yet exist in any reliable form. Even if opium was suspected, proving its role was nearly impossible. Without proof, there was no indictment. Without indictment, there was no warning to print. The absence of labels became self-reinforcing. Because poppy milk was not openly identified as dangerous, it continued to be treated as benign. Because it was treated as benign, deaths associated with it were not recorded as poisonings. Because they were not recorded, there was no statistical signal to provoke alarm. Silence begat silence. Social trust filled the void left by missing information. Mothers trusted midwives, midwives trusted doctors, doctors trusted tradition, chemists trusted profit. Each layer deferred responsibility upward or outward. No one stood close enough to the harm, with enough authority, to break the chain. Even when doubts surfaced, they were muted. A mother might notice her child unusually difficult to wake. A nurse might remark on slowed breathing. These observations were dismissed as normal variations, signs that the medicine was working. In a culture trained to respect authority and suppress instinct, personal unease rarely translated into action. The label stayed clean. It did not need to lie. It simply omitted. And omission, in this case, proved deadlier than deception. Without clear warnings, poppy milk slipped seamlessly into routine care. It became as unremarkable as feeding, as ordinary as swaddling. Only later, much later, would society begin to recognize the danger of substances sold without accountability. But by then, the damage had already been done. Generations of infants had been exposed to a drug they could not metabolize, given in doses no one could measure. Under the comforting illusion of safety, the bottle on the table looked respectable. The label spoke softly, if at all. And in that silence, countless lives were quietly, irrevocably lost. Trust was the quiet currency of the Victorian nursery. It moved hand to hand, unspoken yet absolute, binding mothers to midwives, midwives to doctors, and families to the authority of medicine itself. In a world where knowledge was unevenly distributed and formal education scarce for women, trust filled the spaces where understanding could not reach. To question advice was to question survival. For many mothers, especially those in working households, the midwife was the most trusted figure in their lives. She arrived at birth. She witnessed pain, blood, fear, and relief. She held the newborn before anyone else. Her hands carried experience, earned through repetition, not theory. When she spoke, she did so with the weight of countless deliveries behind her. Her recommendations were not abstract, they were practical, tested, and deeply personal. If a midwife suggested poppy milk, it was rarely framed as an experiment. It was offered as reassurance, as wisdom, as something she herself had seen work time and again. The language mattered. She did not speak of opium or narcotics. She spoke of calming the nerves, settling the stomach, easing the child into rest. Her tone was confident, maternal, calm. And calm, in that moment, was everything. Mothers listened because they needed to. Exhaustion stripped away skepticism. Hunger, illness, and constant labor left little room for doubt. Many mothers were young, some were alone, others had already buried children. The promise of a remedy that could spare them another night of screaming felt less like a risk and more like mercy. There was also the weight of expectation. A mother was judged not only by her care, but by her results. A quiet baby reflected competence. A restless one invited scrutiny. When a trusted authority offered a solution, refusing it felt reckless. If harm followed, blame rarely traveled upward. It settled on the mother herself, her judgment, her failure, her supposed weakness. Doctors, when consulted, rarely contradicted midwives. Victorian medicine was hierarchical but porous. Physicians respected experience, especially in matters of childbirth and infancy. Many shared the same assumptions about sedation and calm. If anything, they reinforced them. Opium was a mainstay of their own practice. Its dangers were acknowledged in theory, but minimized in daily use. This convergence of voices created a closed loop of reassurance. Midwives trusted doctors, doctors trusted tradition, mothers trusted them both. Each reinforced the other's authority, leaving no space for dissent. In such an environment, poppy milk did not feel like a choice. It felt like standard care. Even hesitation was gently smoothed away. If a mother worried that her child slept too deeply, she was reassured that rest was healing. If she feared dependence, she was told infants could not form habits. If she questioned dosage, she was advised to watch the child, not the spoon. These responses did not dismiss concern outright. They redirected it, framing unease as misunderstanding rather than intuition. The emotional bond between caregiver and child complicated matters further. Administering poppy milk was often an act of love, not neglect. Mothers held their infants close, whispering soothing words as they dosed them. They watched anxiously for the return of breathing, for the soft rise and fall of the chest. When sleep came, relief flooded in. Guilt eased. The house grew quiet. The choice felt justified. And when tragedy struck, trust absorbed the shock. A child who failed to wake was mourned, but rarely interrogated. Midwives expressed sorrow, not suspicion. Doctors offered explanations that aligned with existing beliefs: weakness, illness, fate. No one pointed to the remedy that had been recommended in good faith. To do so would fracture the trust that held the system together. Trust, in this sense, became dangerous. It discouraged questioning. It softened warning signs. It allowed a potent drug to circulate freely among those least equipped to measure its risk. Not because mothers were careless, but because they were taught explicitly and implicitly that obedience to authority was safer than intuition. In the Victorian nursery, trust replaced evidence. It flowed through advice, whispered over cradles and bedsides, shaping decisions made in exhaustion and fear. And while it offered comfort in the moment, it also shielded poppy milk from scrutiny, allowing its harm to continue unchecked. The mothers trusted, the midwives believed, and the children paid the price for a faith that had never been tested against the truth. The authority of the Victorian doctor rested not only in knowledge, but in certainty. In starched collars and dark coats, physicians carried the promise of order into homes overwhelmed by illness and fear. Their words were precise, their handwriting decisive, their presence reassuring. To summon a doctor was to summon control itself, someone who could name suffering, classify it, and offer an answer. That answer, more often than not, came in liquid form. Opium sat at the center of Victorian medicine. It was the great equalizer, prescribed for pain, cough, diarrhea, anxiety, insomnia, hysteria. Few substances were as versatile or as trusted. Doctors relied on it because it worked quickly, visibly, and predictably, at least in adults. When a patient slept, the treatment was deemed effective. When pain subsided, the prescription was justified. The logic was simple and dangerously transferable. Infants were not exempt from this reasoning. Doctors viewed babies through the same theoretical lens as adults, merely scaled down. Their nervous systems were thought to be overactive, their cries excessive, their constitutions fragile and easily overstimulated. Sedation was framed as a way to restore balance, to quiet a system overwhelmed by sensation. The goal was not alertness or vitality, but calm. Medical texts reflected this philosophy. Infant distress was described in terms of agitation, irritability, nervous excitability. Remedies aimed to suppress these symptoms rather than investigate their cause. Hunger, infection, and environmental stress were often secondary considerations. If crying ceased, the underlying problem was assumed resolved. Doctors praised quiet children. A baby who slept through the night was considered robust. One who cried incessantly was seen as constitutionally weak. In this framework, poppy milk and similar preparations appeared not merely acceptable, but therapeutic. They produced the desired outcome quickly, sparing families further distress and doctors further visits. Few physicians lingered in the nursery long enough to see the consequences. They arrived after the crying had already exhausted everyone involved. When they prescribed a sedative and returned days later to find the child quiet, they interpreted the result as improvement. If the baby had died in the interim, the explanation came easily. Sudden decline, infantile weakness, unavoidable fate. The remedy itself escaped blame. Medical training did little to challenge this pattern. Physiology was advancing, but pediatrics as a distinct discipline barely existed. Infants were not studied as uniquely vulnerable beings with radically different responses to drugs. Dosage was estimated, not calculated. Experience outweighed experimentation. If something had been used before without obvious catastrophe, it was assumed safe enough to continue. There was also professional pressure. Doctors were expected to provide solutions, not uncertainty. Admitting ignorance threatened authority. In a competitive medical landscape, decisive treatment inspired confidence. Prescribing poppy-based remedies allowed physicians to appear effective, responsive, and modern. Silence in the nursery reflected well on their competence. Even skepticism, when it arose, was muted. Some doctors noted that infants under opiates appeared unnaturally drowsy, difficult to rouse, slow to feed. These observations were often dismissed as transient side effects or signs that the child required continued rest. The absence of immediate disaster was taken as reassurance. When warnings were voiced, they were softened. Medical journals occasionally cautioned against excessive dosing, but rarely condemned the practice outright. The language remained careful, hedged, unwilling to provoke alarm. Without clear alternatives to offer, doctors hesitated to remove a tool that seemed indispensable. Thus, silence became a prescribed outcome. A calm child validated the treatment. A quiet household affirmed the doctor's judgment. In this way, medical authority aligned seamlessly with cultural expectation. Both prized restraint. Both equated stillness with health. Both overlooked the cost of achieving it chemically. The doctor's role, then, was not merely passive. By endorsing poppy milk explicitly or implicitly, physicians lent their credibility to a practice that would otherwise have invited doubt. Their confidence reassured mothers, reinforced midwives, and normalized the presence of opiates in infant care. What began as a domestic remedy became a medically sanctioned one. And so, in the Victorian nursery, silence was not only desired, it was prescribed. The doctor wrote it into the routine, folded it into treatment, and left it behind in small bottles with gentle instructions. The harm that followed remained invisible, absorbed into statistics and grief, never traced back to the moment authority gave its quiet approval. The doctors believed they were easing suffering. What they were often doing instead was teaching a generation to mistake sedation for healing and silence for life itself. The most dangerous thing about poppy milk was how easily it could be bought. No questions were asked at the chemist's counter, no qualifications required, no ledger marked with concern. A mother stepped inside, exchanged a few coins, and left with a bottle capable of stilling a child's breath. The transaction was ordinary, unremarkable, indistinguishable from purchasing soap or lamp oil. In the Victorian marketplace, opium did not hide in shadows. It sat openly on shelves. Chemist shops occupied a peculiar position in 19th century life. They were places of trust, halfway between medicine and commerce. Their windows displayed glass bottles filled with colored liquids, powders, and syrups, symbols of progress and scientific order. The men behind the counters wore clean coats and spoke with confidence. To the public, the chemist represented modern knowledge, distilled into something accessible and affordable. Poppy milk fit perfectly into this world. It was packaged neatly, often with attractive labels that emphasized gentleness and relief. Names suggested peace, rest, and maternal care. Some invoked children directly, promising comfort for the young and relief for weary parents. Rarely did they mention opium. When they did, it was buried beneath language that minimized its significance. There were no age restrictions. An infant's vulnerability did not alter the transaction. The same substances sold to calm adult nerves were offered, in diluted form, to soothe newborns. The assumption was simple. If it could be purchased openly, it must be safe. Commerce stood in for regulation. Availability became proof of legitimacy. The scale of distribution was immense. Urban chemists sold thousands of bottles each year. Rural shops did the same. Traveling salesmen carried patent medicines from town to town, spreading their reach further still. Advertising played its part, appearing in newspapers and pamphlets that promised relief from crying, sleeplessness, and distress. The language was reassuring, almost tender. No warnings interrupted the message. There was no mention of respiratory failure, no acknowledgement of overdose, no explanation of cumulative effect. The responsibility for safe use was shifted quietly onto the buyer, without giving them the information necessary to make such a judgment. Ignorance was not an obstacle, it was built into the system. Poverty intensified reliance on these products. For working families, a few coins spent on poppy milk could mean the difference between rest and collapse. A sedated baby allowed a mother to work longer hours, to sleep before dawn, to keep a job that fed the household. In this calculus, the immediate benefit outweighed unseen risk. The bottle became a tool of survival. Even wealthier families participated. In middle-class homes, poppy milk was often used more discreetly, administered by nurses or nannies, under instruction. Its use carried no stigma. If anything, it was considered refined evidence that the household employed modern solutions rather than crude folk remedies. Class did not protect children from exposure, it merely changed the language around it. The absence of oversight created a false sense of control. Chemists were not required to track adverse outcomes. If a child died, the sale was not revisited. There was no feedback loop to connect purchase with consequence. Each transaction existed in isolation, divorced from its potential aftermath. Occasionally, chemists themselves expressed unease. Some noticed how frequently grieving parents returned to buy the same remedy again, sometimes for another child. Others recognized patterns they could not name, but profit and tradition muted concern. To refuse sale would invite competition elsewhere. The market rewarded silence. This availability blurred moral boundaries. A drug capable of suppressing consciousness in infants became mundane through repetition. Its presence in everyday commerce stripped it of menace. What could be purchased so easily could not, in the public mind, be truly dangerous. And so poppy milk flowed freely through Victorian society. From counter to cradle, bottle to spoon, it passed without ceremony. No authority intervened. No warning label disrupted the exchange. The harm it caused was dispersed across thousands of homes, invisible in its scale, absorbed into a culture already resigned to loss. Only later, long after countless children had slipped into irreversible quiet, would society begin to ask why something so powerful had ever been allowed to be sold so casually. By then, the damage was done. The counter had been cleared, the shelves restocked, and the silence, once purchased so easily, had claimed far more than anyone had imagined. For working mothers, poppy milk was not a convenience. It was a compromise carved out of exhaustion. The Victorian city did not bend to motherhood. Factory whistles blew regardless of who had slept and who had not. Employers did not account for teething, colic, or fevered cries in the night. A woman was expected to arrive on time, work without pause, and endure without complaint. Her child's needs existed outside the machinery of labor, invisible and inconvenient. Many mothers returned to work days after giving birth. Some left infants with neighbors or older children, others carried them to workshops and laundries, cradling them between tasks, praying they would remain quiet. The noise of machines drowned out cries, but only up to a point. A baby who would not settle risked more than irritation. It threatened wages, employment, and shelter. In this environment, silence became a form of protection. A quiet baby meant survival for the family. It meant rent paid, food secured. It meant the difference between endurance and collapse. Poppy milk, with its reliable ability to induce stillness, offered working mothers something the city never did: a measure of control. The choice was rarely framed as moral. It was practical, a calculation made under pressure, with limited options and little support. Rocking and soothing took time that working women did not have. Leaving a crying infant unattended invited neglect charges or social condemnation. Poppy milk promised a solution that fit the demands of industrial life. Its effects aligned seamlessly with factory schedules. A dose administered before dawn could keep a baby quiet for hours. A caretaker could manage multiple children at once. An older sibling could tend to a sedated infant while the mother worked. The drug became woven into the rhythm of labor, an unspoken adaptation to a system that left no room for vulnerability. Poverty intensified its use. Working-class families faced higher rates of illness, malnutrition, and overcrowding. Infants cried more because they suffered more. These were the households most likely to rely on chemical quiet, not out of negligence, but necessity. The city demanded productivity, and poppy milk delivered compliance. The burden was gendered and unrelenting. Fathers worked long hours or were absent entirely. Mothers bore responsibility not only for earning income, but for maintaining order at home. If something went wrong, if a child grew ill or died, the blame settled on them alone. The structural pressures that shaped their choices were rarely acknowledged. Even grief was constrained by labor. A mother who lost a child was often back at work within days. Mourning did not excuse absence. Small coffins were buried quickly. Life moved on. In this context, poppy milk became part of a broader culture that treated infant death as tragic but tolerable, an unfortunate cost of survival rather than a preventable failure. Employers rarely asked questions. A quiet child meant fewer disruptions. A working woman who appeared composed was valued. No one inquired how that composure was achieved. The private cost remained private. The system benefited from the silence without bearing its consequences. This dynamic blurred responsibility further. When poppy milk harmed infants, the fault did not appear to lie with factories, wages, housing, or labor laws. It rested on individual women making impossible choices. The drug absorbed the pressure of the industrial age, becoming a chemical buffer between mothers and an unforgiving world. In this sense, poppy milk was not merely a remedy. It was an adaptation, a coping mechanism shaped by poverty, expectation, and necessity. It allowed working mothers to survive within a system that offered no alternative support for childcare, rest, or recovery. The tragedy lies not only in what poppy milk did to children, it lies in why mothers felt they needed it at all. They were not seeking silence for its own sake. They were seeking a way to endure. And in a city that demanded everything and gave little back, the bottle on the bedside table felt like the only concession available. The burden was never meant to be theirs alone, but they carried it anyway, measured out in spoonfuls, swallowed quietly, in the long shadow of work that never stopped. In the Victorian nursery, hunger was both relentless and invisible. A baby's cry spoke of need, stomach empty, body aching, energy spent, but in a city of soot and smoke, its voice was often misinterpreted. Mothers, exhausted and under-resourced, could not always provide adequate nourishment. Milk spoiled within hours, diluted by necessity or convenience. Food was scarce, inconsistent, and often insufficient to sustain fragile bodies. Yet the expectation remained: infants must not disrupt household order. The cry of hunger became a problem to be managed, a noise to be silenced, not a signal to be answered. Poppy milk offered an illusion of satisfaction. A few drops on the tongue dulled the pangs of emptiness. The infant's stomach remained hungry, but the nervous system could no longer transmit the demand with urgency. The chemical lull masked pain, replaced discomfort with sedation. Sleep followed, or something that resembled sleep so complete that parents, midwives, and nurses believed the child had been fed, soothed, comforted. Hunger was not relieved, it was erased. The effect was seductive for caregivers. The relief was immediate. No more frantic wailing at 3 a.m., no more shaking, pacing, singing, feeding, hoping. The house was quiet. A mother could rest. A nurse could attend other children. In the industrial city where every hour mattered, this chemical quiet was mistaken for effective care. The needs of the child became secondary to the needs of the household. This practice intersected with class and poverty in tragic ways. Among working families, infants were often undernourished from the start. Mothers labored long hours, sometimes returning home to empty cupboards, contaminated water, or sour milk. Hunger cries were constant, a rhythmic reminder of deprivation. Poppy milk provided temporary relief, but at a cost. The child's body received nothing substantial, while the nervous system was artificially quieted. The disparity between appearance and reality grew with each dose. Even in wealthier homes, the danger remained. Middle-class families could afford fresher milk, nurses, and better nutrition. Yet, the expectation of calm persisted. A crying infant threatened reputations, disrupted the orderly household, and drew criticism from visitors or servants. Poppy milk offered a reliable solution to maintain social appearance. The dose silenced hunger, or at least its expression, and preserved decorum. The child's discomfort was hidden, the household's image protected, and the chemical solution became normalized. The science, such as it existed, did not account for consequence. Doctors understood opiates primarily through adult physiology. They knew these substances dulled sensation and induced sleep. The infant body, however, was radically more sensitive. Suppression of crying did not equate to relief of hunger or pain. Repeated dosing risked slowed respiration, convulsions, and death. Yet these risks were largely invisible. A silent infant was interpreted as a content infant, especially in households accustomed to high mortality. Hunger, therefore, became chemically mediated. It was silenced rather than satisfied. The baby's body endured deprivation in quiet, the cost obscured by stillness. A spoon of poppy milk replaced feeding, reassurance, and attention. Over time, the nervous system adapted, tolerance developed, and the illusion of nourishment became an entrenched habit. Hunger persisted, unacknowledged, its presence marked only by the subtle fading of vitality. This was not negligence, but survival. Mothers and nurses acted under extreme pressure, doing the best they could in a world that offered little support and no understanding. Yet the very remedy that promised calm, protection, and order was also complicit in ongoing harm. It silenced cries, but could not feed the body. It preserved appearances, but not life. In the nursery, then, the most basic human need was rewritten. Hunger no longer announced itself in sound. Pain no longer demanded attention. Chemical quiet substituted for nourishment. And the illusion of care became the accepted standard, shaping a generation whose cries were muted not by comfort, but by opium. Teething in the Victorian nursery was treated as both trial and terror. For an infant, it was agony, gums swollen, raw, inflamed, cheeks flushed, eyes glassy with discomfort. Pain radiated through the tiny body, waking the child repeatedly, pulling shrill cries from lips too fragile to contain them. There were no teething rings of modern design, no chilled gels or carefully measured analgesics. Relief, when it came, was piecemeal, improvised, and often insufficient. Every bite, every drool, every fevered squirm became evidence of the body's vulnerability and the caregiver's helplessness. Parents and midwives responded with the tools they knew. Some rubbed the gums with alcohol or honey, hoping to dull irritation. Others pressed cloths cooled by ice or water against tender gums. Yet, these measures were transient. They offered moments of comfort, quickly replaced by renewed pain. Crying became continuous, a pattern stretching into hours and nights that offered no reprieve. Exhaustion followed, heavy as coal smoke, pressing against mothers who had already endured too much. It was in this context that poppy milk appeared as a promise. A few drops taken on the tongue, and the screaming softened, then stopped. Limbs relaxed, eyes fluttered shut. Relief, seemingly, had arrived. The effect was immediate, profound, and persuasive. For the weary caregiver, it felt like mercy, a gentle solution to a problem that had seemed impossible to endure. The moral weight of suffering, for both mother and child, was lifted in a single motion. The bitter truth of pain could be forgotten, but the mercy was false. The child was not healed. The pain was not soothed in any natural sense. It was overridden. The nervous system, still forming, was subdued, made incapable of transmitting the urgent signals that demanded attention. The cry no longer expressed discomfort. It had been chemically muted. A body that needed care was forced into stillness, its protest erased. This illusion of care was reinforced by cultural expectation. A quiet baby was praised. A screaming infant was criticized. In households where appearances mattered and where social judgment pressed on every side, silence became synonymous with compliance and health. When poppy milk produced stillness, it was interpreted as proof of effectiveness. The act of quieting a child became inseparable from the act of caring for one. The line between comfort and sedation blurred almost imperceptibly. Even midwives and doctors, trained in observation and experience, were complicit. They had seen the effects of opium in adults and trusted its ability to calm. In infants, the lack of visible distress was read as success. If the child stopped crying, the treatment worked. If it breathed slowly, the nurse was reassured. If it slept longer, the household exhaled in relief. The mechanism, the pharmacology, was invisible. What mattered was the absence of noise. Excessive use crept in quietly. One dose might be justifiable, 2 tolerable, 3 considered necessary. Each spoonful reinforced the idea that the child's discomfort must be overcome at any cost. Parents, exhausted and fearful, rarely paused to consider the subtle but accumulating risk. Suppression of breathing, cardiac stress, even death. Each act of false mercy compounded the danger. The irony was cruel. What appeared as compassion, the gentle administration of poppy milk, was in truth a form of coercion, imposed on the most vulnerable. The infant's cries, expressions of need and pain, were silenced chemically. Relief for the adult was achieved at the expense of the child's autonomy, and sometimes at the cost of life itself. In the dimly lit nursery, between lace curtains and soot-stained walls, a generation of infants learned silence long before they understood comfort. The mouths that once cried in pain were muted, their anguish hidden beneath sweetness and floral scent. What seemed like mercy was, in fact, a quiet imposition, a false reprieve that obscured suffering rather than alleviated it. The nursery exhaled, the baby lay still. The room was calm, and in that calm, danger waited quietly, unnoticed, patient, and complete. Nightfall in Victorian London was never truly dark, but it was heavy. Gas lamps flickered along streets coated in soot, casting pools of pale yellow that trembled against brick and cobblestone. Smoke from factories and hearths mingled with fog, creating a haze that clung to faces, coats, and curtains alike. The city never slept. Its wheels continued to turn, its engines hummed, its bells rang for work and worship alike. Noise was constant, yet in the quiet of a nursery, the clash of the industrial world felt distant, muffled, irrelevant. What mattered was what happened behind closed doors. Inside these homes, the long Victorian night was measured in hours of vigilance. Mothers, exhausted from days spent labouring or attending to the household, were called repeatedly from shallow sleep by the cries of infants. Hunger, discomfort, fever, and teething demanded attention. Their cries were insistent, unrelenting, a thin, urgent thread stretching into the night. Every wail chipped at patience, every movement tugged at the body, every pleading glance demanded response. There was no pause, no mercy, no real relief. Silence, therefore, became the highest aspiration. A quiet child represented victory over the chaos that encroached from both outside and within. It was a sign that the mother had acted correctly, that the household remained under control, that the night could pass without catastrophe. In such a context, any remedy that delivered immediate calm was treasured above all else. Poppy milk, with its quick-acting sedation, became the tool of choice. The effect was deceptive in its perfection. A few drops, delivered with care, transformed the nursery almost instantly. Muscles slackened, eyes closed, breath slowed, limbs stopped moving, unresisting. The crying ceased not because the child was comforted, but because the signals that conveyed discomfort had been overridden. Pain remained, hunger persisted, distress continued internally, but externally there was only stillness. To a weary mother, this quiet felt miraculous. Relief washed over the room as tangible as warmth from a hearth. Yet the quiet carried danger as well as comfort. Infants under the influence of opiates were vulnerable in ways no caregiver could perceive. Breathing slowed imperceptibly, reflexes dulled, muscles relaxed beyond safe limits. The very calm that brought reassurance could tip a child into life-threatening suppression. In the long Victorian night, every hour counted, every shallow breath mattered. And yet, when the infant remained still, no alarm sounded, no warning arrived, only silence prevailed, and the adult mind interpreted it as peace. The repetition of this pattern reinforced its use. One quiet night led to the next. A mother who had slept briefly after dosing her child saw no harm. Exhaustion diminished skepticism. Relief became habit. The bottle of poppy milk sat ready on the bedside table, an unspoken agreement between necessity and convenience. Each long night justified the previous dose. The rhythm of the household merged with the rhythm of sedation. The cultural weight of the night reinforced the practice. Neighbors, lodgers, and visitors expected decorum. A crying infant in a wealthy home suggested failure. In a poor home, desperation. Social judgment pressed upon women as heavily as fatigue. Any remedy that could silence protest was welcomed, approved, and normalized. Poppy milk, sweet, pale, floral, fit this expectation perfectly. The night became a stage on which maternal competence was measured by how successfully it masked distress. In this environment, danger was invisible. The nursery might be perfectly quiet, yet the balance between life and death was razor-thin. Breath slowed, hearts beat shallow. Every stillness carried a hidden weight. Caregivers, believing they were performing mercy, were often administering risk. The line between comfort and harm was imperceptible, crossed silently, unnoticed, and repeated endlessly through the long Victorian night. Outside, London's wheels and whistles continued. Inside, the nursery lay in deceptive calm. The air smelled faintly of soot, honey, and opium. The gaslight flickered against lace and wallpaper. A mother exhaled, grateful for quiet. And in that stillness, the smallest lives teetered between the worlds of care and peril, held in fragile suspension until dawn or forever. Sleep was never meant to be like this. In the dim glow of the gaslit nursery, infants drifted into a stillness that was chemical, not natural. Their limbs relaxed beyond the gentle surrender of exhaustion. Eyes closed, mouths slack, breaths shallow. To the weary mother or nurse, the silence was a triumph, a moment of calm snatched from the relentless demands of the city, the household, and the body itself. And yet, beneath that fragile quiet, danger slithered unnoticed. Sleep had become something unnatural, a peril disguised as mercy. The mechanism of that danger was insidious. Opium, the active ingredient in poppy milk, depressed the central nervous system. It dulled pain, suppressed reflexes, and slowed the autonomic functions that kept life ticking. In adults, the effect could be measured and survived. In infants, whose bodies were still forming, the margin for error was vanishingly small. A few drops too many could slow the heartbeat, dull the breath, and turn temporary rest into something final. Caregivers could not perceive the difference. The infant lay still. The chest rose slowly, evenly, or so it seemed. The color in the cheeks appeared normal, the lips soft and pink. A mother adjusted a blanket, whispered a lullaby, and believed the child was simply at peace. There was no convulsion, no struggle, no screaming to betray what had truly occurred. The nursery, bathed in shadows and scent, seemed safe. It was only the absence of noise, the soothing of motion, that reassured. And herein lay the cruel irony. The very act intended to protect the child poppy milk, sweetened and measured with care, was capable of extinguishing life. The same remedy that offered calm and order could, in the wrong moment or the wrong batch, cross the line between rest and death. It was not cruelty. It was trust, misplaced and reinforced by exhaustion, authority, and desperation. Physicians, when consulted, rarely recognized the risk. Their training assumed adult physiology, not the fragility of newborn systems. They measured success by cessation of crying and apparent stillness. If the infant slept longer, the treatment was validated. If the child awoke lethargic, it was dismissed as fatigue. Deaths were ascribed to weak constitution, frail health, or natural causes. The subtle physiology of overdose remained largely invisible, and the line between life and danger, invisible as well. Society reinforced the illusion of safety. A quiet nursery was a mark of virtue. Silence was a measure of success. Crying was socially disruptive, morally suspect, inconvenient. The chemical quiet offered by poppy milk was socially sanctioned. It solved a problem that no one else could solve. The absence of noise became proof of effective care, and effective care became synonymous with survival, even when the method threatened it. The repetition of dosing compounded the peril. One night's sleep could lead to another. A second dose, intended to maintain calm, increased the risk of respiratory suppression. A third, administered in exhaustion, brought the infant closer to catastrophe. Each spoonful extended the margin between peaceful rest and mortal danger. Yet, to those administering it, the effect looked benign. The child slept, the household was calm, life continued. Even when harm manifested, it was misunderstood. Breathing that became shallow was attributed to temperament, weakness, or fatigue. Lethargy was seen as contentment. Infants who did not awaken were mourned, but the connection to chemical sedation was rarely made. The danger remained invisible, its presence obscured by the cultural insistence that silence equaled safety. And so, in the long hours of the Victorian night, sleep became a treacherous state. The nursery lay still, the gaslight flickered, and the smallest lives teetered between calm and catastrophe. What appeared as mercy, relief, and control was also a conduit for harm. A thin and invisible line walked every night by mothers, midwives, and infants alike. In the age of soot, labor, and expectation, the quietest moments were often the most dangerous. And no one, least of all the infant, could speak for themselves. In the Victorian city, death was familiar. It arrived early and often, a quiet companion in households filled with soot, smoke, and endless labor. Infant mortality was high. 1 in 4 children might not reach their 5th birthday. In working-class districts, the proportion was even greater. Funerals were brief, coffins small, and grief muted by necessity. Life and death were part of the rhythm of daily existence, accepted as natural, inevitable. And so, when an infant failed to wake, the event was recorded in clinical, unobtrusive terms. The death certificate became a tool of convenience rather than inquiry. Stillborn, weakly, failure to thrive, convulsions, natural causes. These phrases appeared repeatedly in the ledgers of parish clerks and coroners. They were carefully neutral, designed to document without interrogating, to classify without questioning. Each certificate closed a case, silenced doubt, and moved the household forward into the next day of toil, feeding, and survival. The words themselves carried weight. They absolved caregivers from scrutiny, absolved society from responsibility, and obscured the true nature of what had transpired. Few ever asked what had truly caused the silence. The boundaries of knowledge were narrow. Coroners lacked the tools to detect opiate toxicity. Laboratories for chemical analysis were rudimentary, toxicology barely conceptualized. Even if a physician suspected the influence of poppy milk, proving it was another matter entirely. Without evidence, there was no indictment. The death remained a quiet ledger entry, absorbed into statistics that nobody examined too closely. The social and cultural context reinforced this invisibility. A crying infant was expected. An infant who failed to wake could be mourned briefly, but grief had a schedule in a world that demanded labor, obedience, and resilience. Mothers and midwives continued their duties almost immediately. Families rarely had the luxury to investigate, to reflect, to demand answers. The city, indifferent, moved on. Silence in the nursery, so often chemically induced, was normalized in death as well as life. Poppy milk, in its guise of mercy, compounded the tragedy. A child sedated into stillness might simply cease to breathe. Its chest might rise too slowly, the reflex to cry suppressed. When the body cooled in a crib or basket, no one necessarily linked the event to the substance that had brought calm. Instead, death was folded into accepted explanations: frailty, weakness, predestined fragility. The subtle violence of chemical quiet was hidden beneath the veneer of inevitability. Even medical practitioners were complicit in this quiet deception. Physicians and midwives alike accepted infant deaths as ordinary, tragic, yet unsurprising. Their records reflected the prevailing understanding. The infant had not survived. The household grieved. Life continued. Rarely did a practitioner question whether the remedies meant to soothe, might have accelerated the outcome. Silence, after all, was the measure of care. When that silence persisted into the finality of death, it was assumed to confirm natural order rather than reveal human intervention. This pattern created a culture of erasure. Every infant lost under the influence of poppy milk was absorbed into a system that neither named the cause nor confronted the mechanism. Each ledger, each certificate, each quiet entry preserved the illusion of ordinariness. Death became another part of life, predictable, codified, and unquestioned. The chemical intervention, so ordinary, so sweet-smelling, so floral, escaped accountability entirely, and so the nursery remained haunted by its own stillness. The bottles on tables, the spoons on counters, the whispered instructions, all were instruments of quiet, and occasionally of finality. The city, with its streets of coal smoke and unending labor, recorded the loss in neutral phrases, unaware or unwilling to ask what had truly silenced the smallest voices. The infant who would not wake became part of the ledger, part of the night, part of a culture that valued composure over inquiry, calm over understanding, and silence over life itself. In the quiet, the truth waited, unseen, unacknowledged, and unbearably complete. The churchyard was a silent witness. Rows upon rows of small coffins, polished wood pale against the grey earth, told a story of loss both intimate and ordinary. In Victorian London, infant death was not exceptional, it was expected. 1 in 4 children might not survive their earliest years, and families lived with that shadow. Angel babies, they were called, gentle euphemism for the tiny bodies whose lives had barely begun. The name softened grief, made it manageable, and lent a veneer of meaning to the otherwise incomprehensible. Yet beneath the delicate phrasing lay something harsher, a reality of preventable suffering, of chemical stillness mistaken for mercy. Every coffin told a story of urgency, exhaustion, and quiet desperation. Parents carried infants through soot-stained streets, tucked them into boxes too small to accommodate much more than a single blanket. Friends and neighbors attended briefly, murmuring prayers, laying wreaths of flowers that would wilt quickly in the damp air. Mourning was prescribed, ritualized, and limited. The city demanded work, rent, survival. Death, though tragic, could not pause life. In these constrained gestures, grief was compressed, manageable, and, at times, socially acceptable. The nursery, for its part, had been complicit. A child's final night often passed quietly. Poppy milk, sweetened and floral, had dulled cries, slowed breaths, masked hunger, and blunted pain. The infant slept or appeared to sleep while exhaustion pressed upon the caregiver. The absence of sound was interpreted as relief. Calm, in the Victorian ethos, equaled health. When that calm extended into eternity, the same logic held. The child had been frail, delicate, born to angelhood. Few questioned whether chemical stillness had guided the transition from life to death. Social perception shaped acceptance. Mothers who lost children were both pitied and expected to continue. They could display grief for a prescribed time but were otherwise bound by duty. Other children to tend, work to perform, households to maintain. Angel babies became symbols, not only of loss but of moral and social order. Their deaths were folded neatly into narratives of innocence and divine will. The intervention that produced their silence, the opiate-laced milk, remained hidden, its role obscured by trust, exhaustion, and the conventions of the era. Even wealth offered limited reprieve. In middle and upper-class homes, infant mortality was lower, yet still painfully common. Coffins were crafted with greater care, the rituals of mourning extended, and the symbolism of angelic purity emphasized. Nurses and wet nurses administered remedies carefully, often following instructions from physicians or midwives. Still, the danger persisted. Opium, subtly sweetened, continued to numb cries, blur perception, and suppress instinctive reactions. Death, when it came, was often quiet, neat, and socially palatable. The risk, like the remedy itself, was invisible. The repetition of such losses normalized the extraordinary. Communities, accustomed to infant death, rarely investigated patterns. Small coffins became a familiar sight, inscriptions of angelic purity, masking a deeper story of chemical sedation and structural vulnerability. A row of graves spoke of love and devotion, but also of reliance upon substances, too powerful for bodies so small. Families coped as best they could, unaware that the very methods intended to preserve life often contributed to its premature conclusion. And yet, within this ordinariness, the human heart persisted. Each angel baby represented hope deferred, potential unfulfilled, and grief compressed into ritual and propriety. Each small coffin held the weight of silent cries that had been chemically muted, voices that had been softened into stillness. Society, with its moral and practical imperatives, had created a space where suffering could be masked, danger disguised, and death recorded without question. In the nursery, in the home, in the churchyard, the lesson was clear. Silence, no matter how complete, could never be trusted. The sweet floral scent of poppy milk lingered long after the bottles were emptied. The lullabies, whispered softly in dim gaslight, persisted in memory, and the coffins, lined in neat rows, stood as quiet testimony to the peril of a mercy too easily given, a calm too eagerly prized, and a culture that conflated quiet with safety, even in the smallest lives. Numbers, in Victorian London, carried a cold authority. They were written in ledgers, printed in government reports, and quoted in medical journals with the weight of objectivity. Infant mortality rates, hospital records, and parish registries formed a latticework of figures that seemed to explain, justify, and normalize tragedy. 1 in 4 children would not survive their first years. In crowded districts, the proportion was even higher. These numbers were invoked quietly, without commentary, as though repetition could render loss understandable, even acceptable. Behind each figure, however, lay a story obscured by abstraction. The child who never awoke, the coffin too small for more than a swaddling blanket, the grieving mother returning to work before mourning could settle fully. Each entry in a ledger represented an individual life, yet the individual was invisible. Names were often omitted. Causes were generalized: stillborn, weakly, convulsions. Statistical categories flattened the experience of death into a matter of arithmetic, stripping it of context, of sorrow, of culpability. Poppy milk contributed silently to these statistics. Its influence was rarely recorded, rarely questioned. Deaths that resulted from chemical sedation were absorbed into categories of natural weakness, frailty, or misfortune. The drug's role remained invisible, hidden beneath the language of numbers. The infant who succumbed after a dose was counted alongside one who died of infection, one who perished from malnutrition, one who slipped quietly from a weakened constitution. In each case, the ledger made no distinction, and society's collective understanding remained incomplete. This invisibility shaped perception. Numbers suggested inevitability. High mortality became accepted as the natural order of things. Parents, caregivers, and medical professionals internalized this logic. If so many children failed to survive, each additional loss could be rationalized. Death, in this framework, was not alarming, it was ordinary. The ledger reinforced complacency, allowing harmful practices like opiate sedation to continue unchecked. Even reformers struggled to break through the abstraction. Physicians and social critics could advocate for cleaner water, better nutrition, or improved housing. But chemical quieting in nurseries was harder to quantify. Its effects were immediate yet subtle, its dangers cumulative yet delayed. A baby silenced by poppy milk produced the appearance of normalcy. Its death, when it occurred, blended seamlessly into the statistical landscape. Reformers could measure disease, starvation, or epidemic, but the slow, invisible erosion caused by opiates eluded the same clarity. The repetition of these losses created a haunting rhythm. Each year, thousands of infants were added to the rolls of statistical mortality. Every ledger, every table, every report rendered the human tragedies impersonal. Clerks recorded dates and causes. Physicians annotated symptoms and remedies. The public, reading summaries or hearing numbers quoted at meetings, accepted them as fact. Yet behind every digit was a nursery, a bottle, a mother's hand trembling as she administered a dose intended to soothe, but sometimes too potent to survive. Cultural trust reinforced the abstraction. Parents believed what midwives and doctors told them. Caregivers assumed the remedies were safe. Society assumed that the highest authorities had considered danger. And when children did not awaken, the numbers offered comfort. One death among thousands was statistically insignificant, morally neutral, administratively convenient, and still ghosts persisted in the margins. Silent, uncounted, unrecorded, they whispered of harm that could not be measured, of lives shortened by substances marketed as care, of pain masked by chemical quiet. The ledger did not capture the fear of exhaustion, the desperate hope for a few hours of sleep, the quiet horror of a mother realizing her child would not wake. The numbers could not account for that intimacy, that sorrow, that cumulative tragedy. In the city of soot, fog, and relentless labor, statistical ghosts walked unseen. They haunted every nursery, every ledger, every small coffin. They were the invisible witnesses to a culture that valued calm over caution, silence over understanding, and numbers over the lives behind them. And in their quiet presence lingered the truth, that the cost of chemical quiet was often measured in lives never fully acknowledged, deaths never fully explained, and the haunting absence of voices that should have cried. Even in an era steeped in authority and trust, doubt sometimes found its way into the minds of physicians. For decades, doctors had recommended opiates, endorsed tinctures, and silently condoned the use of poppy milk in nurseries. Its effects quiet infants, calm households reinforced their confidence. Yet, as reports of unexplained deaths accumulated, and families whispered anxiously about the sudden stillness of their children, a few voices began to stir unease. These were doctors who looked closely, who questioned patterns, who noticed the subtle correlation between sedation and loss. The signs were often too quiet for the casual observer. A baby who slept excessively, whose limbs remained unnaturally relaxed, whose breathing seemed slower than expected, presented little that could be definitively described as alarming. Yet these practitioners, trained to observe minutiae, began to connect the dots. A pattern emerged. Homes where poppy milk was administered frequently coincided with higher incidences of mortality. It was a subtle, statistical intuition rather than a headline revelation, but it planted seeds of doubt in professional minds. Their doubts were complicated by social pressure. Doctors did not operate in isolation. Their authority depended on trust from midwives, mothers, and fellow physicians. To question a practice that had long been considered standard risked ridicule, professional marginalization, or loss of credibility. Yet some could not ignore the dissonance between the sweet, floral promise of poppy milk and the pale, still bodies they encountered. Observation pressed against doctrine, demanding attention. Some began to document carefully. Case notes, previously perfunctory, grew detailed. Physicians recorded dosage, frequency, and duration alongside outcomes. They noted subtle signs, shallow breathing, delayed reflexes, lethargy disproportionate to apparent illness. Letters circulated among professional circles, often phrased cautiously, posing questions rather than conclusions. Might the continued quietness of certain infants be related to the repeated administration of opiate preparations? One physician wrote, hedging against accusation, yet asserting the possibility. But clear evidence was elusive. Infant physiology was still poorly understood. Toxicology was rudimentary. There was no standardized measurement, no reliable way to determine precisely when a dose had become fatal. The very factors that obscured risk, the sweetness of the preparation, the calm it induced, the brevity of observation, also insulated practitioners from the full reality. Silence was convincing, appearing as health, masking danger. Even a cautious doctor could not prove causation definitively. Yet the questions lingered. Some physicians advised moderation, warning midwives and mothers to reduce frequency or dilute preparations further. Others recommended observation, urging caregivers to monitor breathing and responsiveness. It was a quiet rebellion against established practice, tentative yet persistent. The doubt was not yet public, not yet a force to change culture, but it marked the beginning of a shift in awareness. In some households, the faint warning arrived. Mothers who heeded cautious advice found themselves balancing relief and vigilance. They learned, slowly, that calm could be deceptive, that silence might conceal suffering, that what appeared to be rest could also be peril. The notion that medicine, even prescribed by trusted authorities, could harm the smallest bodies began to take root. These early doubts were fragile, but essential. They challenged unquestioned authority, they observed patterns others dismissed, and they acknowledged a truth that the culture of calm had long suppressed, that chemical quiet, while convenient, could carry peril. The doctors who began to doubt did not yet overturn practice. They did not yet make headlines. But in the shadows of nurseries and lecture halls, their skepticism whispered a possibility that the very remedies designed to soothe might, in their subtlety, destroy. And in that whisper, the first glimmer of accountability began to appear quiet, cautious, and infinitely necessary. In Victorian society, appearances were everything. Every gesture, every posture, every decision within the household carried weight beyond its immediate effect. Mothers were expected to embody propriety, composure, and skill, even when exhaustion pressed like coal against their ribs. A crying infant was more than a source of concern, it was a reflection of the household itself, a subtle indictment of maternal competence, a mark of social standing. In such a world, silence became synonymous with virtue. To keep a child quiet was not merely practical, it was moral. Respectability dictated behavior from cradle to boardroom. A mother's success was measured in part by how little disturbance her children caused. In drawing rooms and kitchens alike, neighbors watched, servants judged, and visitors noted the rhythm of daily life. A baby who cried too often was a social liability, a sign of insufficient care or indulgence. Even fleeting moments of noise could ripple outward, threatening the household's reputation. In this environment, the pressure to suppress sound was immense, and remedies that promised calm were eagerly embraced. The language surrounding infant care reinforced these expectations. Books, pamphlets, and manuals offered guidance couched in moral imperatives. Words like discipline, order, and temperament framed natural infant behavior as something to be corrected. Excessive crying was described as moral weakness or improper upbringing. Silence was equated with obedience, quiet with virtue. A baby who slept through the night was praised not only for health, but as a reflection of good parenting. These texts lent authority to chemical sedation, presenting it as a refinement rather than a risk. Poppy milk fits seamlessly into this discourse. It was marketed and discussed in terms that emphasized care and propriety. Its sweetness, floral scent, and palatable consistency suggested domestic refinement. It promised the result society demanded: a silent infant. Its effects aligned perfectly with the moral framework of the era. To administer poppy milk was not merely practical, it was an affirmation of maternal competence, a visible act of conformity to social expectation. Midwives became key arbiters of respectability. Trusted, experienced, and socially embedded, they reinforced the narrative. Their recommendations were framed in gentle, persuasive language, emphasizing calm, rest, and proper upbringing. To follow their instructions was to demonstrate conscientiousness and moral attention. To question them risked appearing negligent or ignorant. The chemical quiet they endorsed became a tool not just for pacification but for maintaining social standing. Even doctors contributed to the moral framework. Physicians, writing in journals and addressing audiences of parents and caregivers, often praised calm dispositions in infants. They did not question the effects of opiate sedation. They framed them as necessary interventions, consistent with modern science and proper care. Their authority lent weight to the notion that a quiet baby was a healthy, virtuous baby, and that the methods used to achieve quiet were similarly virtuous. The language of respectability also masked danger. By equating stillness with health and morality, society obscured the true risks of chemical sedation. A baby's slowed breath, dulled reflexes, and faintly altered complexion were interpreted as signs of calm, not warning signals. Adult observers were reassured. Silence validated the choice, reinforcing the cycle of administration without scrutiny. In effect, the moral vocabulary became a protective layer. It shielded parents from doubt, masked the consequences of repeated dosing, and normalized a practice that could be lethal. Social expectation, authority, and cultural ideals intertwined, creating an environment where the well-being of the infant was inseparable from the performance of propriety. And so, in the nursery bathed in gaslight and shadow, a generation of children learned compliance not through comfort, attention, or understanding, but through chemical quiet. Silence became both a social imperative and a measure of success, a cruel currency in a world where respectability often outweighed the fragile value of life itself. In the dense labyrinth of Victorian slums, the nursery was a fragile sanctuary, yet it existed on the edge of peril. Streets teemed with life, but not with comfort. Smoke from countless hearths mingled with coal dust and the acrid stench of waste, pressing into homes whose walls were thin, their floors warped and uneven. Overcrowding was constant. Several families might occupy a single dwelling, each with its own routines, complaints, and demands. In such spaces, silence was scarce, and a crying infant could pierce the air like a knife, drawing attention, judgment, or ire from neighbors and relatives alike. Poppy milk offered an immediate, seductive solution. A few drops, measured by hand rather than scale, dulled cries, relaxed limbs, and suppressed the insistent signals of hunger and pain. In the slum household, this quiet was more than convenience, it was survival. Mothers, exhausted from long hours in factories, laundries, and kitchens, often relied on the chemical stillness to complete essential work. Without it, the day threatened to collapse into chaos, wages could be lost, and the fragile structure of the home could unravel. Poppy milk became a tool, almost mechanical in its reliability, to maintain order where life itself was precarious. Yet the margins were thin, dangerously so. The line between sedation and harm was subtle and invisible. Infants with underdeveloped bodies could easily be overwhelmed. A drop too many, a stronger batch, or repeated dosing could slow respiration, depress the heart, and leave a child suspended between life and death. Unlike in wealthier households, where nurses and wet nurses monitored infants closely, Oversight in slum nurseries was limited. Caregivers acted with good intentions but often with little understanding of the substance's potency. Each administration carried risk, but risk was a background constant in lives already shaped by precarity. Overdose often left no spectacle. The infant would lie quiet, limbs slack, chest rising shallowly. Breathing became imperceptible to untrained eyes, yet deep within the body, vital processes slowed. There was no convulsion, no struggle, no dramatic scene to alert observers. Death, when it occurred, was folded into ordinary mortality. Clerks recorded it with neutral phrases: weakly, convulsions, natural causes, and life moved on. The chemical quiet masked not only pain, but the ultimate consequence of its use. The social context reinforced the practice. In the crowded, judgmental environment of the slum, a noisy infant was a liability. Neighbors could accuse, landlords could threaten eviction, and employers could penalize absence or distraction. Mothers, already exhausted and under constant pressure, saw in poppy milk a reprieve, a temporary reprieve from chaos, a way to preserve survival. Silence was a protective measure, and the risk, though real, was intangible until tragedy struck. Even when concerns arose, they were muted. A mother might notice unusual drowsiness, a slower breath, a limp response, but she could not measure danger precisely. Midwives and doctors consulted sparingly, reinforced moderation rather than prohibition. The culture of calm, reinforced by authority and circumstance, overrode instinct and observation. Each spoonful that induced stillness seemed a triumph, until the subtle accumulation of risk resulted in irreparable harm. Thus, in slums and nurseries alike, overdose became a silent spectre. Chemical quiet masked both discomfort and danger. The very remedy that promised relief also carried the potential for irreversible consequence. Deaths were absorbed into statistics, homes continued to function, and mothers carried the weight of survival in one hand, a poisoned spoon in the other. In these cramped, smoke-stained rooms, the illusion of mercy and control walked hand in hand with the shadow of mortality, a constant, invisible companion. And through it all, the city roared, indifferent, as infants slept, some naturally, some chemically, and some never to awaken again. In the silent aftermath of infant deaths, blame fell predictably. Mothers, already stretched thin by labor, hunger, and social expectation, bore the weight of tragedy alone. Their grief was private, confined to whispered sobs in dimly lit rooms or stolen moments behind curtains. Society rarely examined the broader forces that endangered infants: overcrowded housing, polluted air, contaminated water, inadequate nutrition, and limited access to medical care. Instead, it concentrated judgment on the hands that fed, rocked, and medicated the child. The chemical quiet of poppy milk, though sanctioned and widely recommended, was largely invisible in this moral calculus. The cultural framework of responsibility was rigid. A mother whose child cried excessively was seen as inattentive, indulgent, or inept. One whose infant failed to thrive was suspected of negligence, poor judgment, or failure to follow advice. Praise and censure were intertwined. Quiet children were considered evidence of competent care. Distressed or ill children implied maternal deficiency. This perspective left no space to interrogate the systems that shaped daily life, and no language to account for the slow, insidious effects of chemical sedation. Poppy milk both alleviated and exacerbated this dynamic. It provided the illusion of control. A quiet baby was a signal that the mother was attentive, diligent, and capable. It masked the child's suffering, offered temporary relief, and allowed households to meet societal expectations of order. Yet this very remedy also carried risk, slowed breathing, dulled reflexes, and cumulative effects that could lead to death. When tragedy occurred, the mother remained the locus of guilt. The system, the social, medical, and economic pressures that made such a remedy appealing escaped scrutiny. Medical authority reinforced this imbalance. Doctors, midwives, and chemists sanctioned poppy milk. They described its effects as beneficial, its administration as safe when measured carefully. Yet, they rarely acknowledged the full spectrum of potential harm. Deaths were attributed to weakness, constitutional frailty, or misfortune, rather than the intervention itself. The authority of medicine, aligned with cultural norms of maternal responsibility, deflected accountability from systemic inadequacies onto individual caregivers. The economic and social context compounded the pressure. Working-class mothers faced long hours, low wages, and minimal support. Industrial labor demanded attention, precision, and endurance. Any disturbance from a crying infant to a sick child risked wages, employment, and survival. In such circumstances, chemical quiet was not indulgence but necessity. Yet when adverse outcomes arose, the structural pressures that led to its use were ignored. Society focused instead on the visible, immediate figure, the mother at the bedside, the hands that administered the remedy. Even in middle and upper-class households, blame followed a similar pattern. Social appearance demanded composure. Infants who cried or failed to sleep disrupted domestic order and, by extension, family reputation. Chemical sedation promised compliance and decorum, but when a child died, it was the mother's moral and social competence that was questioned. The systems of privilege, medical authority, and domestic expectation obscured the broader dynamics of risk. Thus, the cycle perpetuated itself. Mothers administered poppy milk to protect their children and themselves, only to be blamed when it caused harm. Systems, medical, social, economic, remained largely unexamined, silent witnesses to repeated tragedies. Responsibility was personalized, outcomes depersonalized, and lessons unlearned. The nursery became a site of both care and peril, where devotion could not guarantee safety, and obedience to advice could not protect the most vulnerable. In the shadowed gaslight of Victorian homes, the truth was stark. The mother's love and effort were constant, yet insufficient to shield her child from harm. Society, attentive to appearances but blind to structural hazards, placed guilt on the shoulders of the already burdened. And within this web, the chemical quiet of poppy milk continued to both soothe and endanger, leaving mothers to navigate a world that praised silence while ignoring the systems that made it deadly. In the smoky thoroughfares and crowded streets of Victorian cities, a new industry thrived, one built on promises, appearances, and the chemical quiet of children. Patent medicines, sold openly in chemist shops and through door-to-door salesmen, claimed to cure what ailed the body and soothe what ailed the soul. They were marketed with bold typefaces, colorful bottles, and persuasive language that spoke of modernity, expertise, and reliability. Poppy milk, sweetened, pale, and floral, was among the most insidious of these products. It promised relief for infants, comfort for caregivers, and, crucially, silence for households stretched to breaking. These medicines were carefully packaged to appear trustworthy. Labels emphasized virtue and propriety rather than danger. They promised sleep, calm, and ease. They never detailed the true potency of the opiates contained within, nor the risks inherent in repeated use. Mothers, desperate for rest or relief from a crying child, were reassured by neat handwriting, attractive bottles, and the apparent approval of medical authority. The visual language suggested innocence, milk, flowers, syrup, masking the lethal potential hidden within. The empire of patent medicines thrived on this trust. Chemists profited not merely from sales, but from the illusion of safety. Traveling salesmen spread remedies from town to town, emphasizing reliability, ease, and domestic virtue. Advertisements in newspapers and pamphlets promised a cure for colic, teething, restlessness, and hunger, all wrapped in language designed to soothe parental anxiety. No discussion of dosage limits or potential overdose appeared. Fear was replaced with reassurance. Compliance was ensured through design and persuasion. Competition encouraged amplification. Manufacturers marketed their products as superior, stronger, sweeter, more effective without regard for the cumulative danger of opiate exposure. Each new iteration promised quicker results, longer-lasting calm, and greater ease of administration. Mothers, already exhausted and under immense social pressure, were enticed to give their infants increasingly potent doses, unaware of the margin between effectiveness and harm. Medical endorsement reinforced the empire. Doctors, familiar with opiate use in adults, lent credibility to patent preparations. Their advice, often phrased in careful, approving terms, suggested that chemical quiet was not merely safe, but virtuous. Midwives and caregivers, reading medical journals or listening to professional instruction, incorporated these remedies into daily care routines. The market, authority, and social expectation converged to make administration feel like duty rather than choice. The consequences, however, were invisible and cumulative. Infants sedated into silence did not alert caregivers to pain or hunger. Limbs slackened, reflexes dulled, breathing slowed imperceptibly. Overdose was subtle, sometimes immediate, sometimes gradual. When children died, the death was recorded as weakness, frailty, or misfortune. The ledger absorbed them. The bottle remained on the shelf. The empire continued, built on the appearance of efficacy and the invisibility of harm. Even in wealthy households, the pattern persisted. Chemical quiet became a tool of convenience and social propriety. Nurses administered doses discreetly, ensuring that children conformed to expected behavior. Middle-class parents could afford fresh milk, clean water, and attentive supervision, yet still relied on the promise of poppy milk to maintain order and decorum. In every social stratum, the industry flourished because it offered the one thing mothers valued most: silence. By the time doubts began to appear in professional circles, the empire was entrenched. Thousands of bottles moved through households each year. Generations of infants were exposed to substances their bodies could not process safely. Profit, reputation, and social expectation all protected the practice. Questioning it seemed both impractical and socially suspect. The chemical quiet had become part of domestic life, normalized and almost invisible. In the nursery, as in the marketplace, trust and commerce intertwined. Mothers administered opiates with confidence. Chemists sold them with ease. Advertisements reassured the anxious. And yet, for all its promise of relief, this empire rested on the quietest voices: infants who could not protest, who could not survive the very peace being offered. The combination of profit, persuasion, and authority ensured that the most dangerous remedies were also the most celebrated. And in this system, the line between care and harm was written not in law, but in sugar, floral scent, and the pale promise of poppy milk. The promise of poppy milk was never merely in the bottle. It was in its presentation, its language, its carefully constructed aura of innocence. Victorian advertising was a study in persuasion and subtlety. Posters adorned walls, newspapers carried full-page descriptions, and pamphlets were distributed to homes with the quiet authority of instruction. Poppy milk, along with other patent medicines, was wrapped in words and images that suggested gentleness, domesticity, and moral propriety. Its power did not lie solely in chemistry, but in perception. The infant who drank it seemed calm, healthy, almost angelic, and the remedy itself bore the hallmarks of virtue. The language used in marketing was deliberate. Words like soothing, calming, restful, and gentle appeared repeatedly. They spoke not of pharmacology, but of care. The advertisements emphasized maternal devotion. A mother administering the remedy was framed as attentive, loving, and competent. The product itself was presented as a tool of kindness, a tangible manifestation of nurture. There was no mention of potential overdose, no discussion of risk, no acknowledgement of the fragility of the bodies consuming it. Innocence was projected, both onto the child and the substance. Imagery reinforced the message. Illustrations depicted infants swaddled in lace, sleeping peacefully in cradles adorned with soft blankets. Mothers looked on with serene faces, hands poised over the bottle in gentle administration. The environment was tidy, warm, and comforting. Floral motifs and pastel colors softened the presence of the opiate, transforming it from chemical intervention into an object of domestic virtue. The visual narrative suggested that this was not a drug, but a form of care, an extension of maternal attention and love. Trust was woven into the fabric of the advertising. The imprimatur of medical authority appeared subtly. Phrases like recommended by physicians or endorsed by midwives lent credibility without specifying the context or limitations of such advice. Mothers were reassured that they were following established guidance, that the remedy had been tried, tested, and approved. The repetition of these assertions across multiple advertisements created a collective confidence that masked risk. If society sanctioned it, it must be safe, the logic suggested. Accessibility was part of the illusion. The product was widely available, sold over counters in chemist shops and by traveling salesmen. Pricing was modest, within reach of both working-class and middle-class families. The combination of availability, perceived medical approval, and persuasive marketing created a sense of inevitability. Poppy milk was simply what a responsible mother provided. To refuse it was almost unthinkable, a potential threat to the child's welfare and the mother's reputation. The rhetoric of innocence also obscured consequence. By emphasizing calm, sleep, and comfort, advertisements directed attention away from the subtle but significant physiological effects of opiates on infants. Shallow breathing, dulled reflexes, and the potential for overdose were invisible against the narrative of angelic slumber. Every image and word reinforced the notion that silence was synonymous with health, that sedation was synonymous with care. This manufactured innocence made the substance culturally unassailable. Criticism was rare and muted. A remedy that appeared as nurturing, endorsed by authority, and readily accessible was difficult to challenge. When infant deaths occurred, the advertisement's insistence on calmness lent a veneer of justification. The child had been quiet, the mother attentive, and the product effective. Harm was obscured by virtue. In the nursery, then, perception became reality. The sweet, floral liquid in the glass bottle carried not only opiates, but a carefully crafted promise of innocence. Mothers administered it, believing they were providing care. Children lay still, appearing comforted, while the subtle dangers of overdose remained invisible. Advertising transformed a potentially lethal substance into a symbol of maternal devotion, a testament to propriety, and an instrument of control over the unpredictable rhythms of infant life. And in the quiet glow of the gaslit nursery, innocence and danger coexisted, inseparable and indistinguishable. Not every infant succumbed to the sweet opiate that pervaded Victorian nurseries. Some survived. By luck, by constitution, by the faint resilience of fragile bodies, a number of children endured repeated doses of poppy milk without permanent harm. These survivors were accidents of circumstance, a testament not to safety, but to the unpredictable thresholds of infant physiology. Each swallow was a calculated risk, each spoonful a negotiation between quiet and peril. And yet the very fact of survival was often misread. offering false reassurance to caregivers who believed that the remedy was benign. The experience of these survivors was not always benign in itself. Even when children lived, the effects of repeated exposure to opiates could leave lingering marks. Nervous systems might be dulled, reflexes altered, sleep patterns disturbed. Appetite could be suppressed, growth delayed, and emotional responsiveness muted. Infants who survived the early months often carried with them subtle physiological and developmental consequences invisible to the casual observer, but present beneath the veneer of calm. The nursery, though quiet, became a laboratory of unintended experimentation. Mothers interpreted survival as proof of correctness. A child who slept heavily through the night was praised, believed to be healthy, even if that sleep had been chemically induced. The absence of immediate harm was taken as evidence that dosing was safe. A mother, exhausted and desperate for rest, might continue the practice with renewed confidence, unaware that each successive administration brought its own risks. The accidental survival of some infants reinforced the cycle of chemical quiet, masking the true danger inherent in the practice. Medical professionals contributed to this illusion. Physicians, observing children who survived repeated doses, were reassured. They noted the effectiveness of sedation in achieving calm, emphasizing the apparent success rather than the potential cost. Journals highlighted the utility of opiate preparations, often ignoring the subtle long-term consequences or dismissing them as anecdotal. Their authority lent credibility to the practice, normalizing what was, in essence, a dangerous gamble with fragile lives. Society as a whole ignored the ambiguity. The cultural imperative for silence and propriety reinforced the belief that calm equaled care. Visitors to households praised mothers for their well-behaved children, unaware of the chemical mediation behind the stillness. Relatives assumed competence, neighbors assumed attention, and the broader public, reading sanitized advice in manuals and newspapers, assumed safety. The accidental survival of some infants became a shield against scrutiny, a convenient proof that the practice was effective and necessary. Yet the line between survival and tragedy remained thin. A single miscalculation, a stronger batch, a heavier spoonful, a particularly sensitive infant, could turn quiet into permanent stillness. Accidental survivors were reminders of chance rather than evidence of safety. Their lives existed as fragile exceptions, standing silently amid countless others whose quiet had ended prematurely. The nursery became a place where luck and biology determined fate as much as care, and where chemical intervention, praised for its apparent benefits, hovered perpetually on the border of catastrophe. These survivors carried their own story. Some would thrive, their early chemical sedation leaving only faint traces in memory or behavior. Others might grow into children marked by subtle impairments, nervous sensitivity, or disrupted sleep. Their existence was a quiet testament to the capriciousness of early life and the peril inherent in practices normalized by authority, reinforced by society, and hidden behind the sweet, floral scent of poppy milk. In the shadow of these small triumphs, the truth of the nursery remained unchanged. Calm could be purchased, but life was never guaranteed. And in that fragile balance between safety and danger, accidental survivors stood as both evidence of resilience and a haunting reminder of what had been lost. Even before an infant could speak, the body could learn dependence. Opium, the active ingredient in poppy milk, is insidious in its subtlety. In adults, its effects are familiar: dulling pain, lulling into sleep, numbing awareness. In the infant body, however, these effects are amplified. The nervous system, still forming, responds directly to chemical sedation. Each dose, measured in teaspoons or drops, reshapes not just behavior but physiology. Reflexes slow, pain perception diminishes, hunger signals are suppressed, and in this quiet, dependence quietly takes root. The infant, does not know it. A child cannot understand craving or desire. It cannot remember a world unaltered by the chemical calm, yet the body remembers. Tolerance develops. A dose that produced temporary quiet yesterday may be insufficient today. The nervous system, adaptive and vulnerable, demands more to achieve the same effect. The cycle, invisible to the caregiver, begins silently, its consequences hidden behind the veneer of sleep and stillness. Mothers, exhausted and trusting, continue the practice. The child who cries more on the second day is seen as resistant, fussy, or weak. The solution is obvious. Another dose, slightly stronger, slightly more frequent. Repetition reinforces chemical quiet and strengthens the subtle bond between infant and opiate. Each spoonful seems harmless because it produces immediate calm, yet each reinforces dependence before memory, before understanding, and before life has truly begun. The effect extends beyond the nursery. Even mild repeated exposure in infancy can alter physiology and behavior later. Sleep patterns shift, appetite regulation changes, sensitivity to stress is dulled. Some children develop heightened susceptibility to addiction as their systems adapt to repeated opiate exposure. The quiet that brings relief becomes a formative force, shaping bodies and minds in ways largely invisible to the adults who administer the remedy. Medical authorities seldom recognized these subtleties. Physicians praised quiet infants, focusing on the immediate effects of sedation rather than long-term consequences. Journals spoke of settled nerves and restful sleep as markers of successful care. Few questioned whether tolerance, dependence, or developmental interference could result. When deaths occurred, they were attributed to frailty or weakness, leaving the question of chemical conditioning unexamined. The culture of trust reinforced a system in which early addiction was invisible, accepted, and even encouraged by necessity. Society reinforced the practice. Quiet infants reflected well on mothers, households, and social standing. Noise was inconvenient and morally suspect. Chemical quiet was not only tolerated but valued. The combination of social expectation, trust in authority, and practical necessity allowed repeated exposure to become routine. Dependence formed in a world where recognition of risk was muted, where need and survival outweighed caution. Even survivors carried its mark. Infants who endured repeated doses without fatal consequence might show subtle effects long after. Nervous sensitivity, altered sleep, muted responsiveness, and early chemical conditioning all left traces. What appeared to be rest and calm was, in truth, a body reshaped by opiates before consciousness had fully emerged. Silence had become both refuge and teacher. The paradox of poppy milk lies in its duality. It soothed while it bound, quieted while it conditioned. Mothers administered care in good faith, unaware that dependence could form before the first memory, before the first word, before the child had even begun to grasp the rhythms of the world. The nursery became both sanctuary and incubator, a place where love, exhaustion, and authority intersected with chemical influence to shape lives in ways the city, the system, and the era rarely acknowledged. And so, before infants could speak, before they could understand, before they could even cry for themselves, addiction had already whispered its presence into the stillness of the Victorian nursery. For years, the deaths of infants were absorbed into the muted rhythms of Victorian life. Clerks recorded them in ledgers, mothers mourned quietly, and the city continued its relentless pulse. Yet slowly, imperceptibly, a few coroners began to observe patterns that troubled them. Their offices, dark and quiet except for the scratching of pens and the soft murmur of assistants, became the first places where the consequences of chemical quiet could be examined, however faintly. The signs were subtle. Bodies arrived with little to indicate overt trauma. Limbs were relaxed, faces serene, breathing shallow but seemingly peaceful. Age at death varied, yet many shared a common thread: recent administration of opiate-based remedies. Certificates often read weakly, natural causes, or convulsions, masking what careful observation might reveal. Coroners began to notice that these euphemisms appeared repeatedly in certain districts, in homes where chemical sedation was common. The stillness that had once seemed innocuous now carried a shadow of suspicion. Investigations were constrained by the limits of science. Toxicology in the 19th century was rudimentary. Detecting opiates in small bodies required precision tools and methods still being developed. Many coroners lacked access to such resources. Their examinations relied on observation and circumstantial evidence. They noted patterns, repeated deaths in the same household, unusual lethargy preceding death, infants found limp in cradles after being administered soothing remedies. These correlations were troubling but not definitive. They offered clues rather than conclusions. Social and professional pressures muted early alarms. To suggest that a mother's care, or the remedies she trusted, might contribute to death was controversial. Society preferred to frame infant mortality as inevitable, attributable to frailty or fate. Mothers could be blamed for neglect or incompetence, but challenging widely accepted practices like poppy milk threatened both professional relationships and public trust. Coroners and medical examiners had to balance caution with propriety, documenting suspicions without provoking scandal, often reporting what they could observe while leaving the deeper cause unspoken. Yet even tentative awareness began to shift attitudes. Some coroners began to include additional notes on certificates, documenting administration of opiates, or noting excessive sedation. Reports circulated among medical professionals, often framed as questions rather than accusations. Could repeated opiate use contribute to these deaths? Might chemical sedation be masking warning signs that would otherwise prompt intervention? These inquiries were cautious, hedged with deference to authority and societal norms, yet they planted the seeds of doubt. Communities slowly took note. Families who experienced repeated infant deaths in a single household began to whisper. Neighbors remarked on patterns, sharing stories that subtly questioned the prevailing wisdom. Midwives, once unquestioned, faced the faint stirrings of skepticism from mothers who observed that chemical calm sometimes preceded tragedy. Authority, long considered absolute, now encountered the quiet resistance of observation. The cumulative effect was a gradual awakening. No sudden reform emerged, no sweeping prohibition occurred, but the first cracks appeared in the wall of unquestioned trust that had allowed poppy milk to circulate freely for decades. Coroners, with their pens and ledgers, began to record anomalies, patterns, and questions. Their vigilance, however tentative, marked the beginning of a shift from blind acceptance to critical observation. In the quiet rooms of offices and homes alike, the implications of chemical quiet could no longer be ignored entirely. Infants lay still, as they had for generations, yet now the stillness carried a weight beyond sleep. The watchers, clerks, coroners, midwives began to ask questions that had previously gone unspoken. The city continued its relentless pace, but in the margins of death, recognition had begun. Poppy milk, once invisible in its danger, was slowly becoming visible, its consequences recorded, its presence questioned, and its quiet menace finally facing the faint stirrings of accountability. By the mid-19th century, the quiet, floral-scented remedies of the nursery were drawing scrutiny not from the public, but from the edges of the medical profession itself. Coroners had begun to note patterns, midwives whispered doubts, and a handful of physicians questioned the unquestionable. For the first time, the systems that had enabled the routine sedation of infants faced something resembling examination. Victorian medicine, long assumed infallible in the eyes of the household, was beginning to stand trial, albeit quietly, in journals, in case notes, and in whispered consultations. The stakes were subtle but profound. Chemical sedation was not a rare practice. It was ordinary. Parents relied on it to preserve sanity, order, and social reputation. Midwives endorsed it. Chemists sold it openly. The act of giving poppy milk, measured in drops, had become part of the domestic ritual, an almost invisible interface between care and risk. To call it dangerous was to challenge the authority of every layer of Victorian domestic and medical life. Those who dared to question risked social disapproval, professional criticism, and the quiet resentment of families dependent on their guidance. Medical journals became the first arenas of scrutiny. Articles appeared that carefully phrased doubt. Reports of unusual infant lethargy, repeated administration of opiates, correlations with mortality. Editors and writers hedged, often couching observations in questions rather than conclusions. Could it be, one physician wrote, that repeated opiate use contributes to the unfortunate demise of certain infants rather than mere constitutional weakness? Such statements were rare, tentative, and measured, reflecting both the novelty of forensic observation and the immense professional and social pressure to avoid outright condemnation. The courtroom for debate was smaller, but no less significant. Lectures in medical colleges and meetings of professional societies offered venues for cautious discussion. Physicians debated dosage, chemical potency, and developmental vulnerability. Yet, consensus was slow. Opiates were long accepted in adult medicine. Their effects were familiar, trusted, even revered. Applying the same logic to infants seemed reasonable, even necessary to many. The culture of authority and the habit of chemical calm resisted abrupt change. Families, meanwhile, remained unaware of the stakes. Mothers continued to administer poppy milk, reassured by tradition and the seeming blessing of medical authority. The sweet smell and floral notes of the preparation concealed the danger within. Every infant that slept quietly reinforced confidence. Every death attributed to frailty or misfortune. The subtle trial unfolding in professional circles did not reach the domestic sphere, leaving thousands of households unaware that what seemed care might be harm. Yet, cracks began to appear in the edifice of unquestioned trust. As more cases were observed, more patterns noted. Medical professionals began advocating caution. Guidelines emerged for moderation, observation, and careful administration. Some midwives instructed parents to reduce frequency, to monitor breathing, to watch for lethargy. The first inkling that chemical quiet carried real risk slowly penetrated the practice, even if enforcement remained inconsistent. For the first time, what had been invisible, the potential lethality of opiates for infants, was named, considered, and recorded. The trial of Victorian medicine was, in truth, both moral and scientific. It questioned assumptions about authority, the adequacy of observation, and the consequences of chemical interventions in the most vulnerable bodies. It confronted the dissonance between cultural expectation, silence as virtue, and biological reality, dependence, overdose, death, and it marked the first acknowledgement that practices long trusted, recommended, and normalized might, in fact, be deadly. In the quiet, gas-lit offices, in journals lined with precise observations, Victorian medicine began to recognize its own fallibility. The nursery, still scented with sweetness and stillness, remained unchanged in appearance, but within professional circles, the seeds of awareness had been planted. What had been routine, invisible, and unquestioned was now, for the first time, under scrutiny. And in that scrutiny lay the fragile possibility of change, a hope that silence might one day be achieved through care rather than chemical coercion, and that mercy might finally align with safety. In Victorian London, scandal moved like a whisper before it became a roar. Stories of infant deaths, chemical sedation, and the hidden potency of opiates rarely erupted into public outrage, but when they did, the consequences rippled unevenly across society. Occasionally, a case would escape the controlled confines of nurseries, chemist shops, and medical journals, surfacing in newspapers or gossip among neighbors. These incidents created brief, sharp attention, yet the cultural machinery of denial and propriety quickly intervened, tempering criticism and reshaping perception. The public scandal was often fleeting, replaced by quiet retraction and the careful reassertion of trust. The circumstances of these scandals were varied. A mother might appear in a local court after the sudden death of an infant. A chemist might be questioned about the concentration of a remedy sold over the counter. A coroner might hint at chemical sedation in a report that reached the press. Headlines, when they appeared, were cautious, reflecting society's discomfort with acknowledging the widespread risk. They implied negligence, rarely naming systemic failure or the inherent dangers of opiates. The stories provoked anxiety, but they also reinforced the narrative that chemical quiet was socially sanctioned and broadly trusted. Medical professionals navigated these scandals with care. Doctors and midwives, long accustomed to unquestioned authority, found themselves defending practices previously accepted without discussion. Public attention forced clarification. Labels might be rewritten, instructions rephrased, cautionary notes inserted into journals. These actions, while appearing to acknowledge concern, were often superficial. The product continued to be sold, its administration continued in homes, and the perception of safety largely remained intact. The retraction was quiet, deliberate, and carefully staged to preserve trust. Families absorbed the shocks with muted responses. Mothers who witnessed the deaths of infants under chemical sedation were reassured or pressured by neighbors, midwives, and extended family to accept the explanation provided by authorities. The blame rested on frailty, fate, or maternal error. Any mention of the remedy's potency was downplayed. Letters to journals or private consultations were often tempered by social expectation. Critique was permissible only within bounds that did not threaten the household's appearance or the caregiver's reputation. Silence once again became both protection and concealment. The press played a contradictory role. Newspapers occasionally reported on infant deaths and cautioned against patent medicines, but such coverage was tempered by moral concern, advertising interests, and the desire not to alarm or shame mothers unduly. Articles framed the issue as exceptional, a deviation from otherwise careful care, rather than a widespread systemic problem. The chemical quiet was not outlawed. It was critiqued, advised upon, and then quietly normalized again. Society, in effect, managed scandal through omission. The narrative of care, propriety, and maternal diligence was maintained. Any acknowledgement of risk was couched in language that reassured the public. Moderation, observation, and attention were sufficient to prevent harm. What remained invisible was the cumulative danger, the subtle physiological effects on surviving infants, and the countless lives already lost. The public perception was carefully curated to preserve trust in both medicine and domestic authority. Thus, scandals passed as swiftly as they arrived. The city continued its relentless rhythm. Nurseries remained quiet, chemist shelves remained stocked, and mothers continued to administer remedies, reassured by authority and custom. The fleeting attention of newspapers and inquisitive neighbors faded, leaving behind a restored equilibrium. The danger persisted, hidden beneath floral scent, sweet syrup, and societal expectation. In this careful choreography, the lessons of tragedy were muted. What the public could see, composed mothers, sleeping infants, trusted remedies, was celebrated. What it could not see, the invisible risk, chemical dependence, subtle lethality remained obscured. Scandal arrived, whispered for a moment, then receded, leaving behind the quiet machinery of Victorian life, unchanged in appearance but heavy with hidden consequences. In the corridors of power, legislation moved slowly, weighed down by precedent, social expectation, and the deliberate pace of Victorian bureaucracy. By the time the dangers of chemical sedation in infants became apparent, the systems of governance were already ill-equipped to respond. Laws regulating patent medicines, opiate distribution, and the oversight of nurseries lagged far behind the realities of daily life. The first whispers of regulation emerged decades after poppy milk had become routine, when countless infants had already been exposed to its subtle, pervasive influence. Early attempts at oversight were halting and incomplete. Parliamentary committees examined the sale of opiate-laced remedies and debated the responsibilities of chemists, physicians, and parents. Recommendations emerged slowly. Dosage instructions should be clarified, labels should indicate potential harm, and chemical contents should be disclosed. Yet these measures were often framed as guidance rather than enforceable law. The very institutions responsible for enforcement lacked the capacity and urgency to implement change. Legal frameworks were retrospective, addressing consequences long after the practices they sought to regulate had taken root. The pace of legislation was ill-suited to human vulnerability. Infants, entirely dependent upon caregivers for survival, had no agency in these decisions. By the time statutes began to require labeling or restrict sale, generations of children had been quietly conditioned, sedated, or lost. Chemical quiet had become normalized in both working-class slums and middle-class homes. Mothers and midwives, acting in good faith and under intense social pressure, had already internalized the expectation of calm. The law arrived too late to prevent harm. It could only seek to limit future risk. Even when statutes were enacted, loopholes remained. Patent medicines were often exempt from the strictest regulations. Ingredients could be concealed under trade names. Enforcement depended on local authorities who were uneven in diligence and interpretation. A chemist in one district might face scrutiny, while another operated freely a few streets away. The law, intended as protection, struggled to assert itself against social custom, professional authority, and entrenched practice. Its reach was incomplete, its timing tragic. Public awareness lagged behind legal reform. Many caregivers continued to trust remedies that had long been marketed as safe, relying on generations of instruction and social endorsement. Newspapers and pamphlets began cautiously noting potential dangers, but these warnings competed with decades of reassurance, familiarity, and habit. Compliance was inconsistent, and the cultural inertia of chemical quiet remained powerful. Mothers, midwives, and families often continued practices that were now technically illegal, guided by the immediate pressures of sleep, labor, and societal expectation. The human cost of delay was profound. Thousands of infants had already been exposed to opiates before any meaningful restrictions were imposed. Accidental overdoses, subtle developmental alterations, and chemical dependence occurred quietly, their effects largely unrecorded or misattributed. The law, while a necessary step, arrived after the fact, unable to reach back into nurseries where silent tragedy had already unfolded. Its presence offered little consolation to grieving families or to the surviving infants whose early exposure shaped their development in ways unseen. And yet, the statutes marked a beginning. Though late, they signaled that the unobserved risks of domestic chemical interventions could no longer remain entirely invisible. They offered the first framework for accountability, the first acknowledgement that authority, commerce, and social expectation had, for too long, masked danger behind floral scents and sweet syrup. In the quiet, gas-lit nurseries, the legacy of delayed legislation lingered. a reminder that protection, when written too late, could never undo the harm already done, and that innocence, both real and marketed, had its price in lives quietly claimed. Time, inexorably, began to change the landscape of the Victorian nursery. Poppy milk, once ubiquitous, slowly receded from the shelves of chemist shops and the nightly routines of mothers. Its disappearance was neither sudden nor dramatic, but quiet, almost imperceptible, like the soft extinguishing of a candle in a fogged room. The practice, once endorsed by midwives, recommended by physicians, and marketed as a domestic necessity, began to wane under the weight of accumulating awareness, social scrutiny, and regulatory pressure. Yet even as the remedy vanished, its legacy lingered in countless nurseries, countless lives, and countless deaths, quietly absorbed into statistics and memory. The retreat of poppy milk was driven first by observation. Doctors who had doubted its safety began to assert their voices more firmly. Coroners, whose early notes had hinted at chemical involvement in infant mortality, now began to influence colleagues and institutions. Reports circulated, carefully phrased but unmistakable in implication. The drug that had been marketed as gentle and harmless could, in repeated use, suppress vital reflexes and end lives. The evidence, though not always conclusive, was sufficient to provoke cautious withdrawal from recommendation. Where authority once sanctioned its use, silence now became a safer counsel. Societal shifts accelerated the decline. As newspapers and journals cautiously published observations, families began to question practices that had been routine for generations. Middle-class mothers, anxious about propriety and influenced by evolving medical advice, reduced or abandoned the use of poppy milk. Working-class families, aware of whispered warnings and influenced by the sporadic enforcement of emerging laws, sought alternatives, often returning to traditional soothing practices or simply enduring the infant's cries. The remedy, once ordinary, became suspect. Its disappearance was a reflection not just of regulation, but of growing social awareness. The market responded slowly. Chemist shops removed bottles, replaced them with alternative remedies, or rebranded products to emphasize safety over sedation. Patent medicine advertisements, once abundant and persuasive, vanished from print or shifted focus to other ailments. Poppy milk, in both domestic and commercial realms, was quietly excised from public life. Its absence did not provoke debate. It simply became less visible, less trusted, and ultimately less used. Families and practitioners adapted, often cautiously, feeling the loss of a tool long taken for granted, yet relieved by the reduced risk. Yet disappearance did not equate to remediation. The legacy of the remedy persisted in the bodies and minds of children who had been exposed. Infants who survived repeated dosing carried subtle developmental, neurological, and physiological effects. Chemical quiet had taught dependence before memory, dulled reflexes, and reshaped sleep and appetite patterns. Mothers who administered doses in good faith bore the psychological weight of uncertainty, guilt, and mourning. The remedy had vanished from the household, but its consequences endured, woven invisibly into the fabric of domestic life. Memory, too, carried the imprint. Generations of caregivers recounted lessons learned in whispered caution. Nurses, midwives, and physicians passed down warnings through subtle instruction rather than formal acknowledgement. The disappearance of poppy milk was both a relief and a testament. It marked the end of an era of unquestioned chemical quiet, yet underscored how easily trust, habit, and authority could conceal danger. It became a silent warning, a shadow of mortality and inadvertent harm, haunting the memory of nurseries long after the bottles themselves had vanished. In the quiet of gaslit nurseries, the absence of poppy milk was felt. Cradles were no longer lulled chemically, yet the rhythms of infant care had been forever altered. Mothers and caregivers approached each cry with a mixture of caution and vigilance, aware that silence was no longer guaranteed and that calm must now be earned through attention, observation, and care. The remedy had disappeared, but the lessons it left behind of trust, consequence, and the fragile boundaries between care and harm remained, echoing in every nursery that once welcomed its deceptive promise. Even after poppy milk vanished from chemist shelves and nursery routines, silence persisted, though of a different, haunting variety. The quiet that had once been sought deliberately, sweetened and floral, became indistinguishable from absence. The lull of chemical sedation was replaced by a more somber stillness, the empty rooms where infants had died, the muted gaslight reflecting off polished crib rails, the faint echo of cries that would never return. Families continued with daily life, but the weight of previous loss lingered in every creaking floorboard, every folded blanket, every shadow cast across lace curtains. The silence that remained was both literal and symbolic, a testament to the cumulative cost of decades of trust, habit, and authority gone unquestioned. Mothers carried the quiet with them. Even as new infants arrived, the memory of stillness of bodies once sedated, of lives quietly extinguished, permeated the nursery. Their hands, once confident in administering doses, now trembled slightly with awareness of what could happen. Vigilance replaced routine. Crying was interpreted with a mix of instinct and fear. Every movement observed with the suspicion born of past tragedy. The nursery, though filled with life, bore the residue of absence, a silent pedagogy teaching that peace could be deadly. Society had changed in subtle ways. The laws enacted too late began to influence practice. Midwives communicated warnings more forcefully, and physicians advocated observation and caution. Awareness spread, albeit unevenly, across social strata. Middle-class households, influenced by reading and professional advice, reduced reliance on chemical quiet. Working-class families, aware of risk but constrained by exhaustion and limited resources, substituted gentler forms of care when possible. Yet, in every home, the imprint of past practices remained. Silence, once desirable and safe in appearance, was now fragile, colored by memory and experience. The infants who survived told their own story. Chemical exposure in early life left faint, sometimes subtle traces. Sleep patterns, appetite, temperament, and responsiveness had been altered. Adults, observing these children, noted differences but often lacked language to articulate the cause. The quiet that had once been a tool was now a shadow in the development of a generation, shaping bodies and behaviors in ways that would influence households long after the bottles themselves had disappeared. The very success of poppy milk in producing compliance had left a legacy that could not be erased. Death had left its permanent mark. Small coffins filled churchyards, their angelic inscriptions offering solace yet concealing the reality of chemical intervention. Families mourned briefly before returning to the labor demanded by city and society. Each loss added weight to memory, reinforcing caution and shaping narratives of care. Silence, once imposed artificially, became entwined with grief, a reminder of both what had been lost and what could never be forgotten. Even the landscape of the city reflected it. Streets continued to hum with coal, horse-drawn traffic, and the murmur of human activity. Factories continued their relentless rhythm, indifferent to the quiet tragedies within homes. Yet behind every closed door, the echo of prior stillness lingered, an invisible thread connecting present care with past harm. The nursery, gaslit and shadowed, was both sanctuary and memorial, a place where quiet remained, not as reassurance, but as a testament. And in this persistent silence, the lessons of a generation were etched. Calm was no longer guaranteed by sweet syrup or floral scent. It had to be observed, earned, and respected. Trust, once absolute, was tempered by awareness. Mothers, midwives, and physicians alike carried the weight of what had been, and the caution of what might come. The silence that remained was quiet, yes, but it was filled with memory, with warning, and with the enduring presence of lives once silenced chemically, now never to be forgotten. The lessons of the nursery did not vanish with poppy milk, nor with the disappearance of patent medicines from chemist shelves. They were inscribed into the growing corpus of medical knowledge, etched in the careful notes of physicians, the quiet observations of midwives, and the reluctant accounts of grieving families. Victorian medicine advanced, slowly, unevenly, and always in the shadow of lives lost. Infants who had been sedated into stillness, who had cried less, slept more, and sometimes had never awakened at all. The deaths were accounted for, sometimes statistically, sometimes in anecdote. Coroners, once tentative in their suspicions, began to record details that had previously gone unnoted: dosage, frequency, and the effects of opiate preparations. Medical journals carried cautious reports of patterns: children whose breathing slowed, whose reflexes dulled, whose deaths coincided with chemical administration. These records, initially sparse and hedged, became the foundation upon which later practitioners built understanding. Even the smallest observations, buried in technical prose and cautious phrasing, carried the weight of consequence, forming a silent ledger of knowledge gained at a terrible cost. Physicians began to re-evaluate the assumptions of authority. The same doctors who had once praised calm dispositions now emphasized vigilance. Sleep, they noted, was not always a sign of health. Stillness could conceal weakness, distress, or impending catastrophe. Midwives were instructed to monitor infants with greater scrutiny, to weigh the necessity of remedies against the fragility of developing systems. Chemical intervention was no longer an unquestioned tool. It became a practice to be measured, observed, and justified. The progress of medicine, in this sense, was built on recognition of error, on the quiet acknowledgement that previous trust had been misplaced. Education shifted as a result. Medical students, increasingly exposed to pediatric care, were taught to distinguish between natural sleep and sedation, to recognize the signs of overexposure, and to understand the physiology of infants in ways previously overlooked. Hospitals began to implement protocols for infant care, focusing on nutrition, hygiene, and careful observation. The knowledge that had once been anecdotal, buried in whispered concerns or subtle correlations, became codified into curriculum. Each lecture carried echoes of prior tragedy, a cautionary tale wrapped in empirical observation. Regulation and oversight followed cautiously. Laws and guidelines, though belated, began to shape practice. Chemists were required to disclose ingredients, physicians were encouraged to monitor use, and midwives were instructed in the dangers of overmedication. The culture that had once equated silence with virtue shifted toward vigilance, awareness, and precaution. Progress, however, was incremental, unevenly enforced, and constantly reminded by the memory of what had been lost. Yet the cost of learning remained undeniable. Every statistical observation, every case note, every cautious guideline reflected lives spent and lost in the pursuit of calm. Infants had been silenced chemically before they could cry, before they could protest, before anyone fully understood the consequences. Families bore the grief, caregivers bore the guilt, and medicine bore the knowledge extracted from this quiet suffering. In the quiet of nurseries long after poppy milk was abandoned, the echoes persisted. Gaslight still flickered against wallpaper, cradles still rocked, and mothers still attended to the fragile rhythms of infant life. But now, observation carried weight. Decisions were guided by understanding, caution, and awareness of subtle danger. The stillness that had once been imposed chemically became something to be nurtured naturally, a testament to progress forged on the somber foundation of loss. Medical advancement, in the Victorian nursery was inseparable from grief. Every lesson learned, every guideline established, bore the imprint of those who had been silenced too soon. Progress was not abstract. It was corporeal, intimate, and haunted by the quiet of lives that had passed unnoticed. And in this recognition, medicine began to move toward vigilance, responsibility, and care, a future built painfully, irrevocably, on the losses of the past. The shadow of poppy milk did not vanish entirely with the passing of Victorian London. Its lessons, absorbed into the slow, careful progression of medicine, left traces that reverberated far beyond the nurseries of soot and gaslight. Modern pediatrics, neonatal care, and pharmacology are shaped by an awareness born from observation, tragedy, and hard-earned insight. The echoes of chemical sedation in infants can still be heard in the principles that guide caregivers today, in the protocols that prioritize safety over convenience, and in the cautionary tales that linger in medical literature. The physiological lessons were first and most enduring. Physicians learned that infants are not scaled-down adults. Their systems respond differently, unpredictably, and often dangerously to substances that adults can tolerate. Dosage, metabolism, respiratory reflexes, and sensitivity to opiates became crucial areas of study. What had been normalized in Victorian nurseries, the quiet achieved chemically, was now understood as potentially lethal. Modern neonatal medicine incorporates these hard-earned truths. Careful dosing, precise measurement, and vigilant monitoring are essential. The faint, floral-scented lull of poppy milk became a historical warning, a reminder that what soothes one body can destroy another. Legal and regulatory frameworks emerged from this awareness. Patent medicine empires, once unaccountable, prompted the creation of oversight institutions, labeling requirements, and pharmaceutical standards. Today, every substance administered to infants is subject to scrutiny. Ingredients must be disclosed, dosages standardized, and effects studied rigorously. The absence of such controls in Victorian times had allowed harm to flourish under the guise of care. Modern medicine, informed by those failures, enforces safety protocols that were once unthinkable, ensuring that chemical quiet is deliberate, safe, and reversible rather than deceptive and dangerous. Ethical considerations in medicine were also shaped by history. The trust once placed unquestioningly in midwives, chemists, and physicians now carries a mandate for transparency and informed consent. Caregivers are educated about both benefits and risks. Families are informed participants in decisions about sedation or intervention. The lessons of poppy milk, how reliance on authority without understanding can endanger life, echo in every neonatal intensive care unit, every prescription, and every protocol designed to protect the most vulnerable patients. Yet echoes persist beyond hospitals and law. The cultural valuation of calm, stillness, and quiet, once codified in Victorian ideals of respectability, continues to influence parenting, caregiving, and social expectation. Parents and professionals remain attuned to the pressures of fatigue, social judgment, and the desire for rest. The history of chemical sedation reminds modern society that solutions for convenience must be weighed against risk. Silence, once prized above all, is now understood as insufficient evidence of safety or well-being. Even surviving children bear witness. Generations who were exposed to opiates in infancy experienced subtle, long-term consequences that modern medicine has begun to recognize. Sleep patterns, behavioral regulation, and physiological sensitivity in early childhood are areas where historical experience informs contemporary research. What was once accidental, hidden, and normalized now guides study, intervention, and education, shaping how the smallest patients are observed and protected. The Victorian nursery, in its quiet, gaslit rooms, continues to speak. Its lessons resonate in every measured dose, every careful observation, every regulatory safeguard. The floral scent of poppy milk may have faded from shelves, but its legacy endures in vigilance, ethical responsibility, and the cautious respect for life's most fragile beginnings. Modern medicine carries forward the memory of those silenced too soon, ensuring that the echoes of past era inform present care, and that history's quiet tragedies are never repeated. The nursery, once a space defined by chemical calm and unquestioned authority, began to be reimagined in the late Victorian era and beyond. The lessons of lost infants, poisoned inadvertently by trust and necessity, compelled a rethinking of domestic care. Gaslight still flickered against wallpapered walls, and cradles still held the smallest lives, but the ethos surrounding these spaces began to shift. Quiet was no longer assumed to be synonymous with health. Stillness no longer guaranteed safety. The nursery was being rewritten not with ink or paper, but with observation, precaution, and the careful guidance of knowledge born from tragedy. The first changes were subtle and procedural. Midwives began to instruct mothers on monitoring respiration, reflexes, and responsiveness. No longer was it sufficient to note that the child was asleep or calm. Attention was redirected to the quality of sleep, the rate of breathing, and the infant's reaction to gentle stimulation. The administration of sedatives, once routine, was now framed as a calculated intervention, to be considered only when necessary and in precise doses. Education, rather than authority alone, guided practice. Mothers learned to trust observation as much as instruction. Feeding and nutrition were re-examined as well. Where once opiate-laced syrups might have substituted for proper nourishment, emphasis shifted toward breast milk, fresh cow's milk, and clean, fortified foods. Hunger cries were no longer interpreted as merely inconvenient. They became signals demanding attention. The chemical quiet that had previously masked need was replaced with engagement, care, and feeding schedules designed to meet the infant's biological requirements. Nutrition became not just survival, but a moral and medical responsibility, central to the rewritten ethos of the nursery. Environmental conditions were also scrutinized. Overcrowding, coal smoke, and contaminated water had contributed to vulnerability. Homes were now considered part of the equation. Ventilation, sanitation, and cleanliness were emphasized alongside attentive caregiving. A nursery was no longer simply a place to quiet a child. It was a controlled environment where the infant's physiological and emotional needs could be met safely. Care was holistic, considering both body and context, rather than relying on chemical suppression to maintain order. Medical oversight and guidance became standard. Physicians and pediatricians provided advice rooted in observation and research rather than anecdote alone. Instructions were detailed, dosages carefully calculated, administration monitored, alternatives explored. The culture of unquestioned authority gave way to one of informed guidance. Mothers and nurses were no longer passive recipients of advice. They became active participants in assessment, decision-making, and monitoring. The nursery was no longer a space of blind trust, it was a space of vigilance. Cultural expectations evolved alongside these practical reforms. Silence remained valued, but its significance shifted. Quiet was no longer a proxy for virtue or competence, it was evidence of comfort and well-being, contingent on careful observation and responsive care. Crying was not a moral failing, it was communication. Mothers were taught to interpret it, respond to it, and respect it as information rather than a disturbance. The nursery became a site of interaction, learning, and adaptation rather than passive management. The rewriting of the nursery was gradual, layered, and uneven. Chemical quiet had left its mark, shaping generations of infants and caregivers alike. Yet the transformation was profound. Observation replaced assumption, safety replaced convenience, and engagement replaced chemical compliance. The nursery, once defined by stillness imposed externally, was reimagined as a space where care, attention, and understanding governed the rhythms of infant life. And in the quiet moments that remained not imposed but natural, the Victorian nursery, rewritten, bore witness to a fragile triumph, a commitment to life, to observation, and to the painstaking restoration of trust between child and caregiver. Even as the nursery was rewritten, the memory of those who had been lost lingered in the shadows. The smallest victims of Victorian chemical sedation infants, lulled into stillness by sweet, floral-laced poppy milk, had left a quiet, indelible mark on families, communities, and the emerging practice of medicine. Their presence, though absent in body, persisted in memory, ritual, and record. Gaslit rooms, once perfumed with opiate syrup, now held an almost sacred quiet, a space for reflection on the lives that had been silenced before they could even cry fully. Each loss was a story unspoken, absorbed into grief and caution, shaping how subsequent generations of infants would be cared for. Mothers carried the weight of remembrance. The grief of losing a child to chemical quiet was compounded by societal expectation. Families were not only mourning but navigating judgment, social pressure, and personal guilt. Yet memory offered a different, quieter kind of presence. Mothers recounted what they could remember, the way a tiny hand once clenched, the flutter of eyelashes against fevered cheeks, the sweet scent of syrup that masked pain. These recollections became private testimonies, whispered to other caregivers, or preserved in diaries, ensuring that the lessons of loss were not entirely erased. Communities too bore witness. Parish records, burial registers, and ledgers, though often stripped of individual names, held echoes of these infants' brief lives. Angel babies were recorded formally, their deaths noted with phrases meant to soothe the living. Stillborn, weakly, unfit to thrive. Yet beneath the neutral language lay stories of inadvertent harm, of trust misplaced, and of societal assumptions that equated quiet with safety. Those records became silent witnesses, statistical memorials that informed later medical observation and reform. Medical professionals remembered as well. Doctors and coroners who had begun to doubt, who had noticed patterns of lethargy and mortality in chemically sedated infants, retained these cases in memory, case notes, and correspondence. These recollections shaped the emerging field of pediatrics, influencing protocols, dosing recommendations, and observation standards. The lost infants became instructive, their deaths serving as warnings against complacency, negligence, and unquestioned trust in authority. The memory of harm guided future care, turning tragedy into the foundation of progress. Cultural memory preserved their lessons. Stories of infant vulnerability, chemical sedation, and maternal desperation filtered into popular consciousness, shaping advice manuals, midwifery instruction, and medical guidance. These narratives, though cautious, emphasized vigilance, observation, and restraint. Mothers were instructed to interpret cries, monitor breathing, and question remedies rather than accept them blindly. In this way, the smallest victims, though gone, influenced practice long after the bottles were removed from shelves. The nursery itself became a memorial space. Even in the absence of poppy milk, its previous presence lingered in scent, memory, and ritual. Cradles, blankets, and swaddling cloths bore the imprint of care, both careful and tragic. The quiet of the nursery was no longer merely chemical. It was reflective, attentive, and respectful of life. Caregivers approached infants with knowledge informed by loss, aware that silence could be both comforting and dangerous. The room carried the weight of history, teaching vigilance and empathy through its very atmosphere. Remembering the smallest victims was not sentimental, it was practical. Their stories shaped medicine, household care, and societal understanding. They reminded caregivers that trust must be tempered by observation, that comfort must not come at the expense of life, and that the quietest voices deserve the most attentive care. In every shadowed nursery, in every careful feeding, in every watchful eye, the memory of those infants endured, shaping practice, culture, and conscience. And in that enduring silence, their presence, though unseen, remained potent, a quiet testament to lives too brief to speak, yet powerful enough to transform care for generations to come. Silence in the Victorian nursery had a price, one measured not in coins, but in breaths, stilled, reflexes dulled, and lives shortened. For decades, the promise of quiet, delivered in sweet, floral-laced poppy milk, had been sold as care, virtue, and convenience. A mother who administered it believed she was performing mercy. A midwife who recommended it believed she was preserving health. A chemist who sold it believed he was providing relief. And yet, behind every lull, every softened cry, and every seemingly restful infant, the cost quietly accumulated. It was invisible to the eye, masked by appearances, and minimized by the authority of those who sanctioned its use. The consequences were both immediate and cumulative. Infants, exposed to repeated doses of opiates, were chemically silenced before they could articulate need or discomfort. Their nervous systems were conditioned into quiet, reflexes blunted, appetite suppressed. Hunger was dulled, pain muted, and agitation erased. What seemed like a peaceful night for the caregiver often concealed internal distress, shallow breathing, and subtle physiological compromise. Each administration, though appearing benign, edged the infant closer to risk. Every spoonful delivered calm, yet carried the potential for catastrophe. The human cost extended beyond mortality. Children who survived repeated exposure often bore the imprint of early chemical sedation. Sleep patterns were disrupted, reflexive responses altered, and emotional development subtly affected. Dependence had begun before memory, before language, before social interaction could emerge. These infants lived, but with a body and nervous system conditioned to respond to chemical quiet rather than natural rhythms. The very tool that promised safety and calm had shaped their earliest experience of the world, leaving traces both visible and unseen. Caregivers paid their own toll. Mothers carried the psychological burden of administering a substance capable of harm, relying on trust, authority, and social expectation to justify their choices. When infants did not awaken, grief was compounded by doubt and guilt. Midwives, physicians, and chemists who had sanctioned or supplied poppy milk also bore moral ambiguity. The cost of quiet was distributed across households and professions alike, embedded in the fabric of Victorian domestic life. Society, meanwhile, remained complicit in the calculus. Cultural expectation prioritized silence, composure, and social order over observation, curiosity, or cautious intervention. A crying child was socially inconvenient, quiet was rewarded. Institutions, medical and commercial, reinforced the belief that calm equaled health. When outcomes were tragic, explanations defaulted to weak constitution, frail health, or natural causes. The true cost, the intersection of chemical intervention, social pressure, and physiological vulnerability, remained largely invisible. Even as laws, regulation, and education emerged, the legacy endured. By the time poppy milk disappeared from widespread use, generations had been exposed. Practices shifted, awareness increased, and safety protocols were introduced. Yet the infants who had been silenced chemically, the coffins lined neatly in parish churchyards, the case notes hidden in medical archives, all testified to the subtle but profound consequences of prioritizing quiet over vigilance. In every gaslit nursery, in every swaddled crib, in every whispered lullaby, the cost of quiet persisted. It was measured not only in the absence of sound, but in the fragility of life, the shadow of loss, and the silent shaping of surviving bodies. Silence had been sought as virtue, imposed as necessity, and purchased at a price that society, for decades, neither fully acknowledged nor comprehended. And in that persistent quiet, the lesson remained. Peace, when achieved without understanding, can demand more than anyone ever intended to give. In the gaslit nurseries of Victorian London, silence was treasured, pursued, and revered, but it could also kill. For decades, a simple drop of sweet, floral-scented poppy milk had promised relief. To infants writhing with hunger, pain, or teething, to mothers exhausted by labor, fatigue, and social expectation, to households stretched thin by necessity and propriety, the drug was subtle in its potency, deceptive in its gentleness, and invisible in its consequence. Silence, when imposed chemically, became a double-edged comfort. It lulled bodies, eased nerves, and maintained appearances, while imperceptibly suppressing life itself. The mechanism of danger was insidious. Opium, steeped into milk and syrup, dulled not only cries but reflexes. Hunger signals were erased, pain was muted, breathing slowed imperceptibly, limbs relaxed too fully. The infant's very body was altered into quiet submission before consciousness, memory, or communication had developed. To the mother, the midwife, the nurse, this stillness appeared as relief. To the infant, it was an invisible compromise between survival and the chemical coercion of its earliest days. What seemed harmless, even merciful, was sometimes lethal. Death did not announce itself with drama. There were no convulsions, no violent struggle, no warning cries that could not be silenced. The child simply failed to wake. The chest rose shallowly, then ceased. The quiet that had been so earnestly sought became final, and the world continued as if nothing had occurred. Clerks entered neutral phrases into registers. Weekly, stillborn, natural causes. Society, trained to expect loss, accepted these deaths quietly. The moral and emotional weight fell almost entirely upon the mother, who had trusted authority, guidance, and habit. Trust, authority, and culture had conspired. Midwives endorsed the practice. Physicians sanctioned it. Chemists profited from it. Society equated calm with competence, stillness with health. Mothers, acting in accordance with all instruction and expectation, administered doses of poppy milk in good faith, and in doing so, they placed life in delicate balance. Silence was both their reward and their risk. It preserved order, sustained social respectability, and allowed a measure of reprieve, but it could, with the smallest miscalculation, become permanent. The pattern repeated across households and generations. Statistical ghosts filled parish ledgers, angel babies occupied small coffins, and the echoes of chemical quiet haunted countless nurseries. Some infants survived, carrying subtle traces of early sedation in reflexes, sleep patterns, and emotional responses. Others did not. Their deaths absorbed into the social and medical frameworks of inevitability. The cost of calm, once measured in convenience, was now inscribed in the histories of life lost, in grief compressed, and in the shadowed corners of Victorian domestic life. The lessons were finally recognized, though long after the harm had been done. Medical practice evolved, guidelines emerged, and regulatory frameworks sought to prevent repetition. Observation replaced assumption. Safety became paramount. Caregivers were trained to recognize distress rather than suppress it. The nursery, once a site of chemical quiet, became a place of vigilance and attention. Yet the memory of what silence had meant lingered. It haunted practitioners, historians, and families alike. a reminder of the fragile boundary between mercy and mortality. In the quiet of gaslit rooms, the lesson remained stark and unforgettable. Silence, when achieved chemically, was not proof of care. Stillness, when enforced, could be death. The nursery, with its lace curtains and polished cradles, bore witness to countless moments where trust, exhaustion, and social expectation converged with chemical intervention, and the smallest voices were silenced forever. The calm that once comforted became a cautionary echo, resonating through memory, medical practice, and the enduring narrative of Victorian life. That peace, when unexamined and imposed, can demand the ultimate price.